Chapter 1. In the Shadow of Rome. There are times in history when the flicker of a single flame can light the darkness of an entire age. So it was in the twilight of the Roman world. As the great cities of the Western Roman Empire fell, one by one, a quieter strength began to stir in the east. This was not an empire untouched by turmoil, nor was it free of sorrow. But in its heart, in the city called Constantinople, there remained a pulse of life, a Roman heartbeat echoing across the centuries. The Western Empire had struggled for generations. From the forests of Germania to the wind-swept plains of Hispania, waves of invaders had battered Rome's borders. Within, civil wars, corruption, and plague hollowed the empire from the inside. In 476 CE, the last Western Roman emperor was deposed. What had once been called the Eternal City now seemed to fall silent beneath the weight of ruin. Yet beyond the Adriatic Sea, across the sunlit waters of the Aegean, the Eastern Empire stood firm. Its capital, Constantinople, had been built to endure. Its walls, thick and towering, had repelled the barbarians that poured across Europe. Its wealth, drawn from the fertile lands of Anatolia, Egypt, and the Levant, still flowed. And its people, Greeks, Romans, Armenians, Syrians, carried forward the traditions of the ancient world with a quiet, stubborn pride. Though the world around it changed, Constantinople remained a beacon. It was not the Rome of the Caesars, but it was Roman still in spirit and in law. Here, emperors ruled beneath the shimmering mosaics of palaces and churches. Here, the language of the Forum mingled with the chants of Christian liturgy. And here, on streets paved with the echoes of ages, the Eastern Roman Empire prepared to walk its own path through the shadow of history. The making of Constantinople. The story of Constantinople's rise begins with a single man, an emperor named Constantine. In the early 4th century, he looked upon the ancient city of Byzantium, perched upon a narrow strait where Europe and Asia nearly touch. Here, the Bosphorus gleamed beneath a bright sun. Here, ships from every corner of the known world sailed past in endless procession, and here, Constantine saw the future. Rome had grown old, burdened by its own vastness. Its political heart was fractured, its armies stretched thin. Constantine, wise in the ways of power, knew that a new center was needed, one that could face eastward toward the rising wealth and strength of the empire's eastern provinces. In 330 CE, Constantine rededicated Byzantium as his new capital, Nova Roma, or New Rome. Yet the name that endured was Constantinople, the city of Constantine. With imperial vision and unyielding will, he transformed it. New walls rose, grander than those of old Byzantium. A magnificent hippodrome was built to host chariot races that would captivate generations. Palaces of gleaming marble overlooked the sea. And at the heart of the city, the great church of the Holy Apostles proclaimed the new faith of the empire, Christianity. In Constantinople, east and west met in a dance of stone and light. Roman columns lined the avenues, but the songs of Greek poets echoed in the air. Senators in togas debated in halls adorned with Eastern silks. And in the markets, traders from Alexandria, Antioch, and beyond bartered beneath the shadows of imperial statues. Through Constantine's vision, Byzantium was reborn. No longer a modest city by the sea, it had become the beating heart of an empire that would defy time itself. The dream of continuity. Even as the centuries turned, the people of Constantinople never ceased to call themselves Romans. To them, the word was not merely a title, it was a birthright, a connection to a civilization that had shaped the known world. Though the Western Empire had fallen, its legacy lived on in the laws, customs, and language of the East. Latin remained the language of administration and law for generations. Even as Greek filled the streets and homes of the capital, the great Roman legal codes, adapted and expanded, guided justice across the empire. Emperors still bore the title Imperator Romanorum, Emperor of the Romans, and their coronations echoed the solemn rites of old. Yet this continuity was more than ceremony. It was a living thread that bound the empire to its past. The grandeur of Rome's architecture was echoed in Constantinople's soaring churches and domed basilicas. Roman engineering shaped its aqueducts and fortifications. And Roman ideals of civic duty, of imperial authority, of law above all, endured within its walls. At the same time, a distinct identity began to form. The Eastern Roman Empire absorbed the wisdom of Greek philosophy, the mysticism of the Christian East, and the artistry of Anatolian and Levantine cultures. The result was a civilization both ancient and new, one that could look back upon Rome with reverence, yet forge its own destiny. To a visitor walking the avenues of Constantinople, the layers of history would have been palpable. In the shadows of towering columns, merchants spoke in many tongues. In the echoing halls of Hagia Sophia, Roman law met Christian faith in shimmering mosaics. And beneath the gaze of emperors enthroned in marble, the dream of continuity lived on. A flame passed from hand to hand across the ages. A new era dawns. As the ancient world faded into twilight, the Eastern Roman Empire stood poised upon the threshold of a new era. It was a world of shifting borders, rising powers, and unseen perils, but within its heart, Constantinople remained steadfast, a city of stone and spirit, of memory and hope. The empire would soon face challenges unlike any it had known. From the north and east, new peoples would rise to test its strength. Within its borders, theological debates would stir passions and divide communities. And across the Mediterranean, the growing shadow of Islam would reshape the balance of power. Yet the foundations laid in these early centuries would grant Byzantium the resilience to endure. The city's formidable walls would withstand siege after siege. Its imperial bureaucracy, refined over generations, would manage the complexities of a vast and diverse realm. And its spiritual life, rooted in the Orthodox Christian tradition, would offer a source of unity in times of turmoil. Above all, the legacy of Rome would remain a guiding star. In every imperial decree, in every procession through the golden halls of the great palace, in every whispered prayer beneath the dome of Hagia Sophia, the memory of the eternal city would echo. A new world was dawning, a medieval world in which Byzantium would shine as a beacon of continuity, culture, and faith. Though the western half of the Roman Empire had fallen, the Eastern Roman Empire, what we now call the Byzantine Empire, was just beginning its 1,000-year journey through the tides of history. In the shadow of Rome, a new light had been kindled, and through wars, plagues, triumphs, and sorrows, that light would burn on, steadily, quietly, defiantly, across the long night of the ages. Chapter 2: Justinian's Grand Ambitions. In the quiet hours of the early morning, when the city of Constantinople still slumbered beneath a blanket of stars, the mind of one man remained restless. Emperor Justinian I, seated within the marble halls of his great palace, gazed out toward the Bosphorus, his thoughts adrift upon the waters. In his heart burned a dream, a vision as vast as the sea itself. He would restore the Roman Empire to its ancient glory, weaving east and west once more into a single, radiant whole. Yet this vision was not his alone. By Justinian's side stood a woman of rare strength and insight, his wife, Theodora. Raised not among the palaces of emperors, but in the shadows of the Hippodrome, Theodora's journey had been one of hardship and resilience. Together, their bond forged an unshakable will. They believed that the empire, worn thin by centuries of struggle, could be renewed, that its faded banners might once again command respect across the Mediterranean world. To Justinian, restoration meant more than conquest. It meant the unification of law, the revival of culture, and the reaffirmation of imperial majesty. The columns of ancient Rome would rise anew. The imperial eagle would soar above distant shores. The Christian faith would shine as the empire's guiding light. But every vision demands a price. And to pursue his grand design, Justinian would unleash both the sword and the quill, calling forth generals and jurists alike to shape the destiny of Byzantium. The age of Justinian would become one of brilliance and blood, of creation and destruction, a chapter in history where dreams reached toward the heavens, even as shadows gathered upon the earth. The sword of Belisarius. Among the many who would serve Justinian's cause, none stood taller than General Belisarius. Young, sharp of mind, and unwavering in loyalty, Belisarius became the sword by which Justinian sought to reclaim the lost lands of Rome. His campaigns would span continents, and though they would carve triumph into the annals of Byzantium, they would also bring hardship beyond imagining. The first target lay across the sea, the Vandal kingdom of North Africa. Once Roman, this fertile land had fallen into the hands of Germanic rulers. In 533, Belisarius set sail with a modest force. Trusting not in numbers, but in discipline and strategy, the invasion was swift. The Vandals, complacent in their power, were caught unprepared. In a matter of months, the cities of Carthage and its neighboring territories were brought under Byzantine control. The empire now possessed the vital grain, supplies of Africa, a cornerstone for further campaigns. Emboldened, Justinian turned his gaze westward to the battered heart of Italy. The Ostrogothic kingdom, born from the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, held sway over the peninsula. In 535, Belisarius led his forces into this fractured land, where political discord offered both opportunity and danger. At first, success came quickly. Cities fell. Rome itself, symbol of a lost age, opened its gates to the Byzantines. Yet, as the campaign dragged on, resistance hardened. The Ostrogoths regrouped, laying siege to Rome in a bitter contest that stretched for over a year. Behind the city's ancient walls, Belisarius held firm, his outnumbered forces defying wave after wave of assault. Victory would come, but at a terrible cost. Italy, ravaged by years of war, lay in ruins. Its people suffered famine, disease, and the endless toll of shifting battle lines. Though Belisarius reclaimed vast swathes of land, including Ravenna, the Ostrogothic capital, the dream of a restored Roman Mediterranean came at the price of human sorrow. Even in triumph, the general remained a figure of quiet humility. Belisarius had given much for the emperor's vision, yet he knew that war's greatest victories often carried unseen wounds. The sword had served its purpose. Now it would fall to the pen to shape the empire's soul. Law for the ages. If the sword had reclaimed the empire's lands, the law would reclaim its spirit. Justinian understood that true power lay not only in armies, but in the order of society. To bind his diverse realm together, he sought to craft a legal code that would transcend the chaos of the past, a body of law that could guide both emperor and citizen alike. At his command, the Juris Tribonian assembled a team of scholars, tasked with an immense undertaking. They would sift through centuries of Roman edicts, decrees, and interpretations, preserving what was wise, discarding what was obsolete. The result would be the Corpus Juris Civilis, or the body of civil law. This monumental work unfolded in stages. The Codex Justinianus gathered imperial enactments from ancient Rome to the present day. The Digest, or Pandex, compiled the writings and insights of Rome's greatest legal minds. The Institute served as a teaching manual, ensuring that future generations would understand the principles of justice. And the Novellae, or new laws, reflected the evolving needs of a changing empire. The impact of the Corpus Juris Civilis was profound. Within Byzantium, it provided a clear and consistent legal foundation, upholding the rights of individuals, clarifying the powers of rulers, and establishing the supremacy of law over mere will. Across Europe, it would inspire future legal systems, shaping the very concept of civil law for centuries to come. In its pages, the wisdom of Rome found new voice. Justice was no longer a relic of the past, but a living force within the empire. And for Justinian, this achievement stood alongside his military triumphs, a testament to his vision of a unified, enlightened realm. Yet, even as the emperor's quill inscribed order upon parchment, unrest brewed in the very heart of his capital. A different kind of storm was about to descend upon Constantinople, one born not of distant wars, but of passions within its very walls. Fire in the Hippodrome. It began with a cry, a single word, rising from the vast Hippodrome that stood at Constantinople's heart. Nika, victory, a chant born in the thrill of chariot races, where the city's rival factions, the Blues and the Greens, gathered in fevered competition. But in the winter of 532, the chant became a roar. Beneath the surface of sport lay deeper grievances, resentment toward imperial taxes, anger at corruption, and a populace weary of hardship. When two faction members were condemned to death, the simmering tensions erupted. Crowds filled the Hippodrome, their cries of Nika, now a call for revolt. The riots spread like wildfire. For 5 days, the city burned. Palaces, homes, and even the great church of Hagia Sophia were reduced to ash. Mobs surged through the streets, demanding the emperor's abdication. Within the palace, Justinian faced a terrible choice: flee the city or fight for his throne. It was Theodora who gave him strength. With calm resolve, she spoke words that would echo through history. Purple is the noblest shroud. Better to die an emperor than to live in exile. Inspired, Justinian acted. His generals, Belisarius among them, gathered loyal troops. Through a combination of force and cunning, the revolt was crushed. The Hippodrome, once alive with rebellion, fell silent beneath a sea of the fallen. In the wake of the flames, Justinian rebuilt a new Hagia. Sophia rose from the ruins, a cathedral of unparalleled beauty, crowned by a soaring dome that seemed to touch the heavens. The scars of the Nika riots would never fully fade, but they had forged an emperor more determined than ever to realize his vision. Yet beneath the grandeur and law, beneath the marble and gold, the truth remained. The empire's path was one of both triumph and tragedy. For every dream fulfilled, a shadow lingered. And as Justinian's reign unfolded, the Byzantine Empire would learn anew that greatness often walks hand in hand with sacrifice. Chapter 3: Plague and Survival. It came not with banners or battle cries, nor with ships of conquest or armies of men. The enemy that approached Byzantium arrived on the quiet wings of trade, unseen by the eyes of soldiers and kings. In the year 541, as the empire basked in the glow of its recent triumphs, the first whispers of sickness began to stir. The winds carried more than sea salt across the Mediterranean. From Egypt, a faint shadow followed the ships that docked in Alexandria, then moved northward, drawn along the busy arteries of trade. The merchants of Constantinople, ever eager for the riches of the wider world, welcomed vessels heavy with grain and goods. Yet among the sacks of wheat and bolts of cloth, death itself had travelled. The plague struck first in the Egyptian ports. Reports filtered through the imperial court: fever, swelling, delirium. But in an age of distant news and uncertain messengers, such warnings seemed faint and far away. Life in Constantinople went on beneath the domes of its churches and the spires of its palaces. The city was teeming, vibrant, and unworried. Then, one spring morning, the first cases were seen in the streets of the capital. A merchant, fevered and trembling, collapsed near the Forum. Within days, more followed. Dock workers, bakers, priests, even guards at the city's gates. The air seemed to grow heavier, as if the city itself sensed the invisible tide rising. Soon, the Great Pestilence, as it would come to be known, swept through Constantinople with terrifying speed. The disease, likely borne by fleas upon the backs of rats, moved unseen through markets and homes, striking high and low alike. Fever burned through the bodies of its victims, followed by painful swellings, black buboes beneath the skin. Many who succumbed did so within days. The city streets grew eerily silent. The great Hippodrome, once alive with cheering crowds, stood empty, markets closed. The tolling of funeral bells became the only sound that echoed through the once bustling avenues. Entire households vanished overnight. The living struggled to bury the dead. Beyond the capital, the plague radiated outward, following the paths of trade and conquest. The proud armies of Justinian, triumphant in Italy and Africa, now faced an enemy they could not fight. Throughout the empire, cities emptied, villages withered, and fields went untended. The invisible hand of the pestilence reshaped the land, leaving behind a scar that would endure for generations. The Emperor Stricken, as the empire reeled beneath the weight of the plague, even the highest walls offered no true refuge. In the imperial palace, beneath the marble colonnades and golden ceilings, Justinian himself was not spared. By late summer of 542, the plague had entered the emperor's household. Justinian, ever tireless in his pursuits of law and conquest, soon showed signs of fever. The court watched in dread as the ruler of the Roman world weakened before their eyes. For days, the emperor lay confined to his chambers. Theodora remained steadfast by his side, her resolve unbroken even as the city beyond their windows descended into chaos. Court physicians, uncertain and powerless, applied the ancient remedies they knew: herbs, poultices, prayers. Yet the fever raged on. As Justinian drifted in and out of consciousness, the machinery of the state wavered. The Senate, fearful of the emperor's death, debated who might take the throne. In the streets, order frayed. Without imperial guidance, the people of Constantinople faced their darkest hours alone. But fate had not yet abandoned the emperor. After weeks of fever against all odds, Justinian began to recover. His return to health was seen by many as a miracle, a sign that the empire might endure even in the face of death. Weakened but resolute, Justinian resumed his rule. Yet he emerged from his illness changed. His hair had grown thin, his face lined with new weariness. The once vigorous architect of empire now carried the heavy knowledge of mortality. He had gazed into the abyss and returned, but the world he awoke to was no longer the one he had sought to build. Beyond the palace walls, Constantinople remained a city in mourning. The plague, though slowed, had claimed tens of thousands. In some quarters, there were too few survivors to tend the dead. The stench of decay lingered in the air, and across the empire, from distant outposts to the gates of the capital, the shadow of the pestilence remained. The cost of glory. Even before the plague, the Byzantine Empire had been stretched thin. Justinian's wars, fought across vast distances, had drained the treasury. Campaigns in North Africa, Italy, and the East had consumed men and gold alike. The grandeur of conquest came with a bitter cost. Now, in the aftermath of the plague, that cost grew heavier still. The population of the empire had been decimated. In Constantinople alone, some estimated that nearly half the city's inhabitants had perished. The countryside, too, lay emptied. Fields left fallow, villages abandoned. With fewer to till the land, famine loomed on the horizon. The army, once the sharp edge of imperial ambition, now struggled to replenish its ranks. Entire units had been lost to disease. Recruitment faltered. The veterans who remained carried both scars of battle and the haunting memory of the pestilence. In Italy, where Belisarius had carved out victories, Gothic resistance flared anew, taking advantage of the weakened Byzantine forces. Economically, the empire suffered grievously. Trade slowed to a trickle. Taxes, once collected with precision, now fell short as entire provinces faced collapse. The flow of revenue that had built churches and funded armies now dwindled. Inflation rose, and with it, unrest. Yet amid this hardship, the spirit of Byzantium did not fully break. The imperial administration, though battered, adapted. Grain was imported where possible. New taxes were levied, though they bred resentment. The church offered solace to the grieving, binding communities through faith when little else remained. For Justinian, the dream of a restored Roman world now seemed more distant. The cost of glory had been steep. The great conquests remained, etched in the annals of history, but their foundation had been shaken. The emperor, once driven by boundless ambition, now ruled an empire caught between triumph and exhaustion. The empire left behind. As the years turned, the empire began to heal, slowly, painfully. The plague receded, though it would return in waves for decades to come. The fields were sown anew. The streets of Constantinople filled once more with the hum of life. Though the shadows of loss remained in every household, Justinian, older now and marked by all he had endured, pressed on. His reign, extending into the late 560s, saw continued efforts to strengthen the empire's borders and reaffirm its laws. The Hagia Sophia, rebuilt after the Nika riots, stood as a symbol of resilience, its great dome a testament to faith and endurance. Yet beneath the surface, change was coming. Theodora, Justinian's steadfast companion, had passed years earlier. Without her counsel, the emperor grew more isolated. His focus turned inward, toward matters of doctrine and legacy. The once vibrant court grew more somber. In 565, Justinian breathed his last. He had ruled for nearly 4 decades, a span marked by both soaring achievement and profound trial. The empire he left behind was larger than it had been when he took the throne. Its laws were more unified, its spirit more deeply Christian, but it was also weary, its people scarred by plague and war, its treasury strained, its borders vulnerable. The successors to Justinian would inherit both his triumphs and his burdens. They would face new threats from Persians in the east, from Slavs and Avars in the north. The vision of a fully restored Roman Empire would fade, replaced by the struggle simply to preserve what remained. Yet, through it all, the heart of Byzantium would endure. The city of Constantinople, its great walls still unbroken, would stand as a beacon in a changing world. The empire, though battered, would adapt and survive, carrying forward the flame of Roman legacy into a new and uncertain age. And so, as the twilight of Justinian's reign faded into the dawn of another chapter, the story of Byzantium continued, resilient, unyielding, ever watchful beneath the stars. Chapter 4. The Storm of Invasions. In the early years of the 7th century, the mighty walls of Constantinople stood as silent witnesses to a troubled land. The once glorious Byzantine Empire was a shadow of its former self. Decades of internal strife, economic hardship, and endless wars had drained its strength. Corruption rotted the imperial court. The people, weary and disillusioned, looked to the heavens for hope, but found little. Amid this growing despair, a civil war brewed. The Emperor Phocas, a brutal and unpopular ruler, had seized the throne through bloodshed. His reign was marked by terror and incompetence. The provinces burned with rebellion. The army was in disarray, enemies circled, sensing an opportunity to strike a wounded empire. Into this chaos stepped a man named Heraclius. He was not born in Constantinople, but in the distant lands of North Africa, in the city of Carthage. His father, a respected general, urged him to act. Heraclius gathered a fleet and sailed across the Mediterranean with a singular purpose: to save the empire from within. In 610 AD, Heraclius reached Constantinople. The people, exhausted by Phocas's cruelty, welcomed him. Without mercy, Heraclius deposed the tyrant and claimed the imperial diadem. Yet his victory marked only the beginning of a far greater struggle. He inherited a throne in crisis. The treasury was empty. The borders lay exposed. The might of the Byzantine Empire hung by a thread. Heraclius understood that survival demanded change. He began by reforming the crumbling government, restoring discipline to the military, and calling upon the faith of the people to unite behind him. The road ahead would be steep, and soon a storm unlike any the empire had faced would descend upon its lands. The Persian Wars. Even as Heraclius donned the imperial robes, a powerful enemy advanced. To the east, the Sassanid Persian Empire, under the ambitious King Khosrow II, had launched a relentless campaign against Byzantium. Decades of fragile peace had shattered. Now, Persian armies surged across Byzantine territory like an unstoppable tide. They captured city after city. Antioch, Jerusalem, Alexandria, all fell. In a devastating blow, the Persians seized the true cross from Jerusalem, a sacred relic that symbolized the heart of Christendom. The loss sent shockwaves through the empire. Faith was tested. The people feared that God had turned his face away. Heraclius knew that conventional strategies would not suffice. The empire lacked funds, troops, and time. Yet surrender was unthinkable. In a daring move, he restructured the empire's finances, melting church treasures to fund the war effort. With grim resolve, he rallied what forces remained and prepared for an audacious counterstrike. From 622 AD onward, Heraclius led his army across treacherous mountain passes and harsh deserts. He waged a brilliant campaign deep within Persian lands. Using speed, surprise, and tactical mastery, he struck at the heart of the Sassanid Empire. The decisive moment came in 627 AD at the Battle of Nineveh. Under grey, wintry skies, the Byzantine army clashed with Persian forces. The fighting was fierce, the stakes immense, but Heraclius, driven by unwavering purpose, led his men to a stunning victory. The Persian forces crumbled. Their king faced rebellion at home. The tide had turned. Within a year, the true cross was returned to Jerusalem. Though battered and weary, the Byzantine Empire had survived the Persian storm. Yet as the soldiers returned home, a new and even more dangerous threat rose on the distant horizon. A new world rises. As Byzantium licked its wounds from the Persian Wars, a new force stirred in the deserts of Arabia. In 632 AD, the Prophet Muhammad had united the Arab tribes under a banner of faith and conquest. Following his death, the Rashidun Caliphate emerged, fierce, determined, and eager to expand its reach. The Arab armies moved with remarkable speed. They were hardened by the desert, inspired by their beliefs, and led by skilled commanders. In 636 AD, they set their sights on the rich lands of Syria, Byzantium's vulnerable flank. The two forces met on the plains near the Yarmouk River. The Byzantines, still recovering from years of war, faced an army smaller in number, but unmatched in spirit. The Battle of Yarmouk would become one of the most pivotal clashes in Byzantine history. Over 6 brutal days, the armies fought beneath a blistering sun. Dust clouded the air, arrows darkened the sky. The Byzantines fought valiantly, but exhaustion, poor leadership, and the enemy's relentless assault wore them down. By the battle's end, the Byzantine army lay shattered. Syria was lost. The defeat at Yarmouk marked the beginning of a seismic shift in the region. The Arab forces soon swept through Palestine, Egypt, and beyond. An empire that had stood for centuries now faced the prospect of losing its eastern provinces. For Heraclius, the news was a bitter blow. The victories against Persia now seemed like distant memories. Yet amidst this darkness, a secret weapon would soon give the empire a fighting chance to defend its heart. Constantinople, the secret of Greek fire. As Arab forces advanced across former Byzantine territories, one city stood defiant: Constantinople. Its towering walls, formidable and proud, had protected it for generations. But now, even these seemed vulnerable. In 674 AD, the Arab navy arrived at the city's gates. The sea sparkled with warships. The siege began, and with it came the empire's greatest trial. Yet within Constantinople's walls, an extraordinary invention awaited, one that would tip the scales: Greek fire. Its exact composition was a closely guarded state secret, known to only a handful of craftsmen. It burned fiercely, could not be extinguished by water, and clung to whatever it touched. Delivered through specially designed siphons aboard Byzantine ships, it transformed the tide of naval warfare. As the Arab fleet approached, Byzantine ships sailed forth. Streams of liquid fire arced through the air, igniting enemy vessels. The sea itself seemed to burn. Panic spread among the attackers. No defense could withstand the flames. For 4 long years, the siege raged. But time and again, Greek fire repelled the enemy. In 678 AD, the battered Arab forces withdrew. Constantinople had survived yet another storm. The secret of Greek fire remained a symbol of Byzantine ingenuity, a mysterious weapon that preserved the empire in its darkest hour. Though the empire's borders had shrunk and new enemies loomed, its spirit remained unbroken. Constantinople still stood, a beacon of resilience amidst a world in turmoil. As the fires of war dimmed, the people of the city looked once more to the future. The storms would return. The battles were far from over. But for now, beneath the ancient domes and along the marbled streets, hope endured. The story of Byzantium, scarred but unbowed, would continue. Chapter 5. From Rome to Byzantium. There are times in history when change does not announce itself in a single moment. It comes quietly, like a slow tide creeping up the shore. In Byzantium, this tide was the transformation of language, a shift that mirrored the empire's evolving soul. For centuries after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, Latin remained the language of state. It adorned official documents, framed imperial laws, and echoed through the marble halls of the palace. To be Roman was to speak, read, and govern in Latin. Yet beyond the court and its scribes, the heart of the empire beat to a different rhythm. In the streets of Constantinople, it was not Latin, but Greek that danced from the lips of merchants, scholars, and common folk. Greek had been the language of learning, poetry, and philosophy in the Eastern Mediterranean for 1,000 years. Even as Rome had conquered the Hellenistic world, Greek culture had endured, woven into the daily life of the people. As the empire's territories contracted, so too did its cultural tether to the Latin West. Provinces in Italy and the Western Mediterranean slipped away, drawn under the sway of new kingdoms and powers. The imperial court, long preoccupied with distant conquests, now faced growing threats closer to home. The East became the empire's center of gravity, and with it, the Greek tongue rose in prominence. By the 7th century, the shift was undeniable. Latin no longer suited an empire whose lands, faith, and people were increasingly Greek in identity. Greek became the language of administration, the voice of law, the medium of imperial edicts. Emperors who once addressed their subjects in Latin now did so in Greek. The great legal works of Justinian, though originally composed in Latin, were translated to meet the needs of a changing world. This was no sudden rupture, no sharp dividing line. Rather, it was the gentle fading of one language, replaced by another more attuned to the spirit of the age. The empire that called itself Roman had embraced a new voice, one that carried the wisdom of philosophers and the prayers of monks, the songs of the marketplace and the solemn chants of the cathedral. In this way, the Byzantines forged an identity all their own. They were heirs to Rome, yet unmistakably Greek in language and culture. The death of Latin marked not an end, but a transformation, one that would shape the empire's character for centuries to come. Icons and controversy. As the Byzantine world grew more deeply entwined with Orthodox Christianity, a new tradition took root, one that would both inspire devotion and spark fierce debate. It was the veneration of icons, sacred images of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints, rendered in paint, mosaic, and gold. In a world where many could not read, icons became windows into the divine. They adorned the walls of churches, flickered in the glow of oil lamps, and graced the private corners of humble homes. For the faithful, they were more than art. They were symbols of spiritual presence, conduits of prayer, and reminders of the eternal. Yet not all viewed them so kindly. Among the empire's theologians and rulers A growing unease began to stir. Some questioned whether the veneration of images strayed too close to idolatry, forbidden by scripture. Others feared that the burgeoning cult of icons placed too much power in the hands of monks and popular movements, challenging imperial authority. In the 8th century, these tensions burst forth in a storm of controversy. Under Emperor Leo III, a sweeping decree was issued. The use of icons in public worship was to be forbidden. The first wave of iconoclasm, literally the breaking of icons, had begun. Across the empire, images were stripped from churches, mosaics were defaced, and sacred art was destroyed. Monasteries, where icon veneration remained deeply rooted, became centers of resistance. The conflict was not merely theological, it was political, cultural, and personal. It divided families, set bishops against bishops, and drew a deep rift between Constantinople and the Pope in Rome. For decades, the empire wrestled with the iconoclast controversy. Emperors rose and fell by their stance on the issue. At times, icons were restored, only to be banned once more. The struggle revealed the profound depth of feeling that images could inspire, and the lengths to which both rulers and believers would go to defend their vision of faith. By the mid-9th century, the tide turned. Under Empress Theodora, icons were restored to their place in Orthodox worship, a triumph celebrated each year as the triumph of orthodoxy. Yet the scars of the conflict remained, etched not only in the walls of churches, but in the collective memory of Byzantium. Icons would endure as a defining feature of Byzantine spirituality, silent yet eloquent, embodying the beauty and mystery of the divine. And through their long and troubled history, they would remind the empire of both the power of faith and the perils of division. An empire of ceremony. Beneath the towering domes of Constantinople's palaces and cathedrals, the Byzantine court wove a tapestry of ritual and splendor unmatched in the medieval world. Here, ceremony was not mere ornament. It was the lifeblood of imperial power, a language of symbols through which the emperor's majesty was proclaimed. The Book of Ceremonies, compiled in the 10th century, offers a window into this elaborate world. It described with painstaking detail the processions, coronations, and daily rituals that framed the life of the court. Every gesture, every garment, every word was carefully chosen to reflect the cosmic order that the emperor was believed to embody. In these rituals, the emperor was not simply a man. He was God's representative on earth, the visible link between heaven and the empire. His entrance into the throne room was an event of profound significance. Courtiers and ambassadors would bow before him, their approach choreographed to reflect their rank and loyalty. The throne itself was a marvel of mechanical ingenuity. In some accounts, it could rise and descend as if by magic. Golden lions flanked the emperor's seat, their mouths fashioned to emit roars. Silver trees with jeweled birds added to the aura of wonder. These devices served not merely to impress, but to convey the transcendent nature of imperial authority. Ceremony extended beyond the palace. The great festivals of the church calendar were marked by imperial presence and pageantry. On feast days, the emperor processed through the city, accompanied by clergy, soldiers, and nobles. The streets were lined with awestruck citizens who caught a fleeting glimpse of the ruler upon whom their hopes rested. Through these rituals, the emperor's image was woven into the fabric of the people's imagination. In a world of uncertainty, the shimmering order of the court offered a vision of stability and divine favor. Even in times of crisis, the ceremonies persisted, reminding all who witnessed them that the empire, like the liturgies of the church, was part of a larger, unbroken continuum. In Byzantium, Ceremony was not illusion. It was a living force, binding ruler and ruled, heaven and earth, past and present. And through its enduring beauty, it helped sustain the empire's soul through the long centuries of its existence. Faith and power. At the heart of Byzantine life stood the Orthodox Church, a wellspring of faith, culture, and identity. Yet its relationship with imperial power was neither simple nor static. It was a bond forged in cooperation and tension, where spiritual and temporal authority intertwined in complex ways. From the time of Constantine onward, emperors had embraced Christianity as both a personal faith and a tool of governance. The emperor was seen as Basileus kai autokrator, ruler and sovereign, chosen by God to shepherd the earthly realm. In this role, he was both protector of the church and its ultimate patron. Yet the boundaries of this authority were often blurred. Emperors convened church councils, appointed patriarchs, and influenced matters of doctrine. They walked a delicate line, upholding the church's spiritual mission while ensuring it served the needs of the state. The church, in turn, shaped the empire's moral and cultural life. Its monasteries preserved learning, its liturgies filled the great domes of Hagia Sophia with chants of transcendent beauty. Icons, relics, and holy processions became part of the rhythm of daily life. The faith of Byzantium was not confined to the cathedral, it suffused every corner of society. Yet moments of conflict arose, none more bitter than during the iconoclast period, when emperors sought to impose their vision upon the church. In such times, monks and bishops stood in defiance, asserting the autonomy of the spiritual realm. These struggles revealed the enduring power of faith to challenge even the mightiest of rulers. In the end, the relationship between church and empire was one of symbiosis. The emperor derived legitimacy from the church's blessing, while the church drew strength from imperial support. Together, they forged a uniquely Byzantine synthesis, a vision of sacred empire where faith and power were inextricably bound. Through triumphs and trials, this bond would endure. It shaped the identity of Byzantium, giving rise to a civilization where the earthly and the divine walked hand in hand beneath the gilded skies of Constantinople. Chapter 6. The Macedonian Renaissance. The Byzantine Empire had known both splendor and suffering. By the 9th century, it had weathered centuries of invasion, civil strife, and religious turmoil. Its borders had shrunk, its spirit had dimmed, yet beneath the surface, the embers of resilience still glowed. Out of this weary world rose a dynasty that would guide the empire into a new golden age, the Macedonian dynasty, and at its head stood a man whose journey began not in the halls of privilege, but in the humblest of origins. Basil. I was born a peasant in the rugged lands of Macedonia. His youth was marked by hardship, yet his ambition burned bright. Through sheer talent and charm, he climbed the ranks of imperial society. He became a skilled horseman, a trusted bodyguard, and ultimately caught the eye of Emperor Michael III. Basil's rise was swift. In a dramatic turn of fortune, he married into the imperial family and soon claimed the throne for himself. In 867 AD, he was crowned emperor. A peasant no longer, he now bore the weight of an empire. Yet Basil was no mere opportunist. He saw in Byzantium not just a realm to rule, but a civilization to renew. The empire had grown stagnant. The grandeur of old Rome seemed a distant memory. Basil and his successors sought to change that. The Macedonian emperors, Basil I, Leo VI, Constantine VII, and those who followed, brought new energy to the empire. They reformed its laws, strengthened its armies, and fostered a spirit of learning. Their leadership would lift Byzantium from its long night and into the light once more. The Macedonian Renaissance. The reign of the Macedonian dynasty sparked a cultural rebirth now known as the Macedonian Renaissance. In this era, the empire rediscovered the treasures of its ancient past and wove them into the fabric of a vibrant present. At the heart of this revival was learning. The emperors, particularly Constantine VII, himself a scholar, sought to preserve and expand the wisdom of antiquity. Monks and scribes copied ancient Greek and Roman texts, ensuring their survival for future generations. Libraries swelled with works of philosophy, science, and history. Art, too, flourished. The empire's painters and mosaicists found new inspiration. In shimmering golden icons and vivid frescoes, they captured the divine mysteries of faith. The great churches of Constantinople once again rang with beauty, where stone, glass, and light met in sacred harmony. Architecture reached new heights. Magnificent domes rose over ancient streets. The Hagia Sophia remained the crown jewel of Byzantine architecture, its vast interior a place where the heavens seemed to descend to earth. But this Renaissance was not confined to scholars and artists alone. Its spirit touched the common people. In marketplaces and homes, in song and story, the renewed culture of Byzantium spread. The empire began to see itself once more as the heir of Rome and the guardian of Christian civilization. Through wisdom and beauty, the Macedonian emperors wove a new tapestry of hope, one that would shine even in the shadow of future storms. The sword and the cross. While the artists and scholars shaped the empire's soul, its leaders also sought to shape the hearts of those beyond its borders. The Macedonian era saw not only military campaigns, but also missions of faith, efforts to bring the light of Christianity to new peoples. Among the most significant of these missions was the Christianization of the slaves. The Slavic tribes, dwelling in the lands of Eastern Europe, were emerging as a powerful force. To secure both peace and influence, Byzantium sought to bring them into the fold of Christian civilization. The task fell to two remarkable brothers from Thessalonica, Cyril and Methodius. Learned and devout, they journeyed into Slavic lands, not as conquerors, but as teachers. Understanding the power of language, they created the Glagolitic script, which would later evolve into Cyrillic. Through this gift, the Slavs could read the scriptures and embrace the Christian faith in their own tongue. The impact was profound. In time, the peoples of Bulgaria, Serbia, and Kievan Rus embraced orthodoxy, binding their futures to the spiritual and cultural orbit of Byzantium. The cross had become a bridge, uniting diverse peoples under a shared faith. Through both sword and scripture, the empire extended its influence. Its military defended its borders. Its missionaries spread its vision of a Christian world. Together, these efforts deepened Byzantium's role as both a temporal power and a spiritual beacon. The Bulgar Slayer. Amid the triumphs of culture and faith, the empire also faced fierce foes. Chief among them were the Bulgars, a formidable kingdom to the empire's north. For decades, the two powers clashed. The struggle would reach its climax under one of Byzantium's most formidable rulers, Basil II. Basil II, known to history as the Bulgar Slayer, was a man of steel will and tireless resolve. He inherited the throne in turbulent times, facing internal revolts and external threats. But Basil was not one to be deterred. His reign would be defined by relentless determination. The wars against the Bulgars stretched for decades. The enemy was fierce and resourceful, their mountain strongholds difficult to breach. Yet Basil waged a methodical campaign, refusing to be drawn into rash action. Slowly, steadily, he tightened the empire's grip. The decisive moment came in 1014 AD. At the Battle of Clydion, Basil's forces inflicted a crushing defeat on the Bulgar army. Thousands of prisoners were taken. In a harsh gesture meant to break their will, Basil ordered that the prisoners be blinded, save for one man in every 100, left with a single eye to lead the others home. When the Bulgar king, Samuel, saw his broken army, legend says he died of shock. The war would continue for a few more years, but the outcome was now clear. By 1018 AD, the Bulgarian state had fallen. The empire had secured one of its last great military triumphs. Under Basil, too, Byzantium reached its greatest territorial extent in centuries. From the Adriatic to the Euphrates, its banners flew high. Yet the victories came at a cost. The emperor's relentless focus on war left other matters neglected. In the years after his death, new challenges would arise. But for a time, under the Macedonian emperors, the Byzantine Empire had shone bright once more, a beacon of learning, faith, and power in a restless world. Chapter 7: The Schism of Christendom. The mightiest divisions in history often do not begin with a single blow. They are slow fractures, formed over generations, quiet tensions that deepen until at last the surface breaks. So it was with the great rift between the eastern and western branches of the Christian Church, a wound that opened fully in the year 1054, but whose roots reached back through centuries of difference. In the earliest days of the empire's Christian faith, the Church was one body, its bishops and patriarchs bound together in shared belief, if not always in perfect harmony. The Bishop of Rome, the Pope, was accorded great honor as the successor to St. Peter. Yet in the East, in the Golden City of Constantinople, the Patriarch likewise held deep authority. Over time, distance, culture, and language began to set them apart. The decline of Latin in the East and the embrace of Greek was one layer of this growing divide. But beneath language lay deeper currents, disputes over church governance, differing views on the role of the emperor in spiritual affairs, and subtle but profound variations in doctrine. Among these differences, one became emblematic of the whole: the Filioque clause. In the West, the Nicene Creed had been altered to declare that the Holy Spirit proceeded from the Father and the Son. In the East, this addition was seen as both unauthorized and theologically unsound. It was a small change in words, but it carried vast implications for how each side understood the nature of God. Political tensions compounded the strain. The Pope, increasingly entwined with emerging Western powers, looked upon the Byzantines with growing suspicion. Meanwhile, emperors in Constantinople viewed the Roman Church as too ambitious, too quick to meddle in imperial affairs. By 1054, these simmering tensions reached their breaking point. A delegation from the Pope arrived in Constantinople, bearing demands and grievances. The Patriarch, Michael Cerularius, stood firm. When diplomacy failed, both sides reached for the most final of measures: excommunication. On a summer's day, the papal legates strode into Hagia Sophia and placed upon the altar a bull of excommunication. The Patriarch, in turn, excommunicated the legates. In that moment, the ancient church was rent in two, East and West, divided by both faith and pride. Though efforts at reconciliation would come and go, the schism would endure for centuries. It was not simply a matter of doctrine, it was the reflection of an empire turning inward, even as new dangers gathered at its borders. Manzikert. a bitter defeat. While church and court debated in Constantinople, the empire's frontiers grew perilous. In the east, a new power had arisen among the Turkic peoples, the Seljuk Turks, fierce warriors and master horsemen, whose banners now advanced toward the empire's heartlands. For generations, the Byzantines had held the high plateaus of Anatolia, a land of fertile fields and vital trade routes. It was a cornerstone of imperial strength. Yet in the years following Justinian's long reign, defense had grown weaker, and the empire's forces were often scattered and poorly led. In 1071, Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes sought to reverse this decline. Determined to confront the Seljuk threat head-on, he gathered a large army and marched eastward. His goal was to deliver a decisive blow that would restore Byzantine control over Anatolia. Yet the campaign was fraught with danger from the outset. The emperor's forces were a patchwork of contingents: Byzantine regulars, mercenaries, and levies drawn from the provinces. Political intrigue further undermined unity. Powerful nobles at court sought to weaken Romanos's authority, even as he led the empire to war. Near the town of Manzikert, in the rugged lands of Armenia, the two armies met. The Byzantines outnumbered the Turks, yet the Seljuk leader, Alp Arslan, fought with cunning and discipline. Through feigned retreats and sudden ambushes, the Seljuks drew the Byzantine forces into disarray. Amid the chaos, betrayal struck. Key Byzantine commanders withdrew their troops, leaving Romanos's center exposed. Surrounded, the imperial army collapsed. The emperor himself was captured, an event almost without precedent in Byzantine history. Though Romanos would be released, the consequences of Manzikert were catastrophic. The empire's hold on Anatolia crumbled. Towns and fortresses fell to the Turks. Peasant populations fled westward in waves. The fertile lands that had sustained the empire for centuries were lost or left vulnerable. The defeat at Manzikert was more than a military failure. It was a turning point, a moment when the outward strength of Byzantium was revealed as hollow. The loss of Anatolia would haunt the empire, draining its resources and fracturing its unity. In the shadow of this bitter defeat, the empire's long twilight began. A house divided. The wounds of Manzikert did not heal in isolation. Within Constantinople, the empire itself was unraveling from within. In the decades following the battle, imperial authority weakened. Factions at court vied for influence, their intrigues sapping the energy needed for recovery. Emperors rose and fell with dizzying speed, some through force of arms, others through the dark arts of palace politics. Corruption seeped through the veins of government. Officials enriched themselves at the expense of the common people. Tax burdens grew heavier, even as revenues dwindled. In the provinces, local lords and military commanders acted with increasing independence, undermining the cohesion of imperial rule. The once proud Byzantine army, already battered at Manzikert, suffered further decline. Mercenaries were hired to fill its ranks, soldiers loyal only to coin, not to emperor or empire. Defense of the frontiers became erratic and unreliable. Amid this disarray, the people of the empire turned inward. Faith remained a source of solace, but even the church was touched by the empire's troubles. Patriarchs came and went, often appointed through imperial favor rather than spiritual merit. Monasteries grew in wealth and influence, yet they too were drawn into the web of politics. Beneath the surface, discontent simmered. In the countryside, peasants struggled to survive amid war, taxation, and lawlessness. In the cities, old families watched with dismay as imperial dignity eroded. The memory of former greatness remained, but it was a memory increasingly at odds with the harsh realities of the present. By the dawn of the 12th century, Byzantium was a house divided. Its rulers looked outward with unease, knowing that new powers were rising beyond the empire's battered borders. Yet even as the empire's light flickered, it had not yet been extinguished. From an unexpected quarter, new forces would soon enter the stage, forces that would reshape the fate of Byzantium and the wider world. The West turns its gaze. As Byzantium faltered, eyes in the West turned once more toward the East. In Rome and across Latin Christendom, a new spirit of religious fervor was taking hold, one that would soon give rise to the great movement known as the Crusades. The initial spark came from the East itself. Beset by the Seljuks and struggling to defend its dwindling territories, the empire sent out a call for aid. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, recognizing the gravity of the situation, appealed to Pope Urban II and the rulers of the West for military assistance. In 1095, at the Council of Clermont, Pope Urban seized upon this appeal. He called upon the knights and lords of Christendom to take up the cross, not merely to aid Byzantium, but to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim rule. The response was overwhelming. Across Europe, thousands answered the call. Crusader armies gathered, driven by a complex mix of piety, adventure, and ambition. For Byzantium, this surge of Western aid was both a blessing and a threat. The empire needed help to resist the Seljuks and reclaim lost ground. Yet the arrival of vast, unruly armies of Latin knights posed new dangers. Emperor Alexios moved carefully. He required the Crusaders to swear oaths of loyalty and sought to channel their efforts in ways that would benefit Byzantium. In the early campaigns, this delicate diplomacy succeeded. Key cities in Asia Minor were retaken and the empire regained, a measure of strength. Yet tensions simmered beneath the surface. The cultural gulf between the Greeks and the Latin Crusaders was wide. Byzantines viewed the Westerners as uncultured and unpredictable. The Crusaders, in turn, mistrusted the empire's motives and envied its wealth. As the Crusades unfolded, these tensions deepened. Later crusading forces would act with increasing independence, at times even turning against Byzantine interests. The uneasy alliance forged in the fires of necessity would prove fragile, and in time it would break in tragic ways. For now, the West had turned its gaze upon the East. Byzantium stood at the center of a vast new movement, one that would bring both opportunity and peril. In the shadow of schism and defeat, a new chapter of the empire's long story was beginning. And in the soft glow of Constantinople's great domes, the people of the city could only watch and wait, their fate once more bound to forces beyond their walls. Chapter 8: The Fourth Crusade and the Fall of the City. The dawn of the 13th century found the Byzantine Empire standing, but weary. Its borders had shrunk, its treasury was thin. The throne was no longer the pillar of strength it once had been. Yet still, Constantinople, the queen of cities, gleamed beneath the sun, its great domes rising above marble streets. It had withstood so many storms, and perhaps the people believed it would withstand them all. But a greater shadow was forming on the western horizon. In 1202, a new crusade was gathering. The Fourth Crusade, called to reclaim Jerusalem, brought together knights and soldiers from across Western Europe. Yet from its start, the crusade was tangled in debt and intrigue. The Crusaders, lacking funds, struck a deal with the Venetians. In exchange for transport to the Holy Land, they would first assist in capturing the city of Zara, a Christian port. This compromise set a dangerous precedent. one that placed profit over piety. In the chaos of this arrangement, a new opportunity emerged. Alexios IV Angelos, son of a deposed Byzantine emperor, approached the Crusaders with an offer. If they would help him reclaim his father's throne in Constantinople, he promised vast rewards, money, troops, and the submission of the Orthodox Church to Rome. The Venetians saw fortune. The Crusaders saw a way to pay their mounting debts. And so, the course of the crusade changed. By 1203, the fleet sailed not for Jerusalem, but for Constantinople. Within the city, the people watched in disbelief as ships filled with foreign banners appeared on the horizon. The Queen of Cities would soon face betrayal not from old foes, but from supposed brothers in Christ. The sack of the Queen of Cities. In the summer of 1203, the Crusader fleet reached Constantinople's walls. The great Theodosian walls had stood for centuries, defying sieges of every kind. But this siege would be unlike any the city had known. At first, the Crusaders demanded that the citizens accept Alexios IV as emperor. Under pressure and fearing worse, the reigning emperor, Alexios III, fled. The young claimant was crowned, but promises made in desperation proved impossible to keep. The imperial treasury was empty. The promised riches never appeared. The mood in the city turned bitter. Soon, resentment boiled over. The people rebelled against Alexios IV and his Western backers. Amid growing violence, a palace coup toppled the young emperor. Now leaderless, the Crusaders faced a stark choice: abandon their campaign in shame, or take the city by force. On April 12, 1204, they chose force. Under a red dawn, the assault began. Crusaders breached the sea walls with ladders and siege engines. Fires consumed parts of the city. The defenders fought bravely, but the enemy was too strong. By nightfall, Constantinople had fallen. The sack that followed was brutal and merciless. Churches were plundered, sacred relics were stolen or destroyed. Priceless works of art, testaments to centuries of Byzantine splendor, were lost to flame and greed. The great Hagia Sophia, once a beacon of faith, was desecrated. The suffering of the people was immense. Nobles, monks, and commoners alike faced violence and theft. The Queen of Cities, for so long the jewel of Christendom, now lay in ruin. The Fourth Crusade, meant to defend the faith, had instead shattered one of its greatest centers, an empire. In exile. In the wake of the sack, a Latin empire was established in Constantinople. Western lords carved up the empire's lands, crowning their own emperor in the conquered city. But their rule was fragile, built on betrayal and blood. Across the former empire, resistance stirred. Byzantine nobles and generals fled to distant provinces, determined to preserve their culture and faith. From this flight arose several successor states. Chief among them was the Empire of Nicaea, founded by the noble Lascaris family. Here, the Byzantine spirit endured. The scholars, priests, and artists who escaped the fall of the city now found refuge and purpose in Nicaea's modest halls. In the rugged lands of Epirus, another remnant state took shape. There too, Byzantine traditions lived on. Further east, in Trebizond, a distant outpost by the Black Sea, the imperial line continued under the Komnenos family. Though scattered and weakened, these successor states kept the flame of Byzantium alive. They preserved its language, its faith, and its vision of empire. In monasteries and courts, they nurtured hope that one day the Queen of Cities might be restored. For the people of Constantinople who remained under Latin rule, life was harsh. The new rulers imposed foreign customs and exacted heavy taxes. The grandeur of the city faded, yet in secret prayers and whispered tales, the memory of Byzantium's glory endured. The empire had fallen, but it was not yet dead. Hope rekindled. For more than half a century, the Latin Empire clung to life, weakened by constant threats. The rulers of Nicaea watched patiently, rebuilding their strength and waiting for the right moment. By the mid-13th century, that moment had come. Under the leadership of Michael A. from Palaiologos, Nicaea became a beacon for Byzantine loyalists. A skilled diplomat and determined general, Michael prepared for the great task of reclaiming Constantinople. In 1261, with Latin power waning and the city's defenses neglected, the opportunity arose. A small force, led by the general Alexios Strategopoulos, approached the city under cover of darkness. By fate or fortune, most of the Latin garrison had left on a campaign. The city lay vulnerable. On the night of July 24, 1261, Byzantine forces breached the walls. The Latin defenders, caught unprepared, fled. By dawn, the banners of Byzantium flew once more over the Hagia Sophia. Michael VIII entered the city to be crowned emperor. The Queen of Cities was Byzantine again, but the restoration was fragile. The city was scarred by decades of neglect and plunder. Its population had dwindled. The treasury was bare. Michael VIII worked tirelessly to rebuild Constantinople, restoring its churches, fortifying its walls, and reviving its culture. Yet the empire that rose from the ashes was a shadow of its former self. Surrounded by powerful enemies and burdened by internal divisions, it would never again match the might of its earlier days. Still, in the hearts of its people, hope flickered. The Queen of Cities had survived betrayal and ruin, and though the road ahead was uncertain, the legacy of Byzantium lived on, in stone and scripture, in song and spirit. Chapter 9. The Final Days. As twilight settled over the empire of Byzantium, it did not come all at once. It arrived softly, like the slow dimming of a great lamp, its glow lingering in the vast halls of Constantinople long after its reach had faded elsewhere. The restored empire of the Palaiologos dynasty was a shadow of its former might. Yet, within that shadow flickered one last stubborn light. In 1261, Michael VIII Palaiologos had retaken Constantinople from the Latin occupiers, reclaiming the heart of Byzantium after the trauma of the Fourth Crusade. The walls of the city still stood tall, though battered. Its streets once again echoed with Greek chants and the processions of Orthodox clergy. The empire had survived, but only just. The realm over which the Palaiology ruled was no longer the sprawling dominion of Justinian's age. Most of Anatolia was lost to Turkish emirs. The Balkans were contested ground, where Serbian, Bulgarian, and later Ottoman forces pressed upon Byzantine borders. Beyond Constantinople itself, the empire clung to scattered territories, small islands of power adrift in an encroaching sea. Within the capital, the emperors fought to preserve not only their throne, but the soul of Byzantium. Diplomacy became their chief weapon. They forged alliances, sought aid from Western powers, and even entertained the possibility of church union with Rome, an idea that stirred fierce resistance among the Orthodox faithful. Yet for all their efforts, the Palaiology faced mounting challenges. The imperial treasury was nearly empty. The city's once thriving trade had shifted north to Italian merchants in the Adriatic and Black Seas. The great aristocratic families, grown powerful in the provinces, often acted with more independence than loyalty. Even so, there remained a stubborn pride in the empire's continuity. The court maintained its elaborate ceremonies. The emperor still wore the purple. The Hagia Sophia still crowned the city with its majestic dome, and within the hearts of many Byzantines, the belief endured that their city, Queen of Cities, might yet withstand the tides of time. But time, relentless and indifferent, pressed forward. To the east, a new force was rising, one that would soon darken the last glow of Byzantine twilight, Ottoman Ascendancy. Across the narrow straits of the Bosphorus, beyond the old boundaries of imperial power, the Ottoman Turks gathered strength. What had begun as a small frontier principality under Osman, had, within the span of a century, transformed into a formidable empire in its own right. The Ottomans were unlike the enemies Byzantium had faced in the past. They combined military prowess with political acumen, blending the traditions of Turkic warriors with the administrative skills inherited from the Islamic world. Their forces moved swiftly, their leaders ruled decisively. Throughout the 14th century, Ottoman banners advanced through Anatolia and into the Balkans. One by one, former Byzantine strongholds fell. Thessaloniki, the empire's second city, was lost. The plains of Thrace, once the empire's breadbasket, came under Ottoman control. For the Palaiology, the Ottoman rise was a grim reality. They sought aid from Western Europe, appealing to kings and popes for support. Occasional expeditions of Latin knights arrived, but they were too few and too late. Meanwhile, the Ottomans continued their methodical advance. By the early 15th century, Byzantium was surrounded. Constantinople itself remained a beacon of resistance, but its hinterlands were gone. The city depended increasingly on foreign merchants for supplies. Its population had dwindled, its wealth diminished. The empire's last emperors walked a narrow path, offering tribute to the Ottoman sultans, negotiating truces, all the while seeking some miracle that might alter their fate. Yet, Sultan Mehmed II, who ascended to the Ottoman throne in 1451, harbored no illusions about Byzantium. He saw in Constantinople not a feeble relic, but a prize to be claimed, a city whose capture would cement his legacy and bridge the worlds of East and West. The storm was gathering, and within the ancient city, beneath its fading splendor, preparations for a final defense quietly began. The walls of Theodosius. For 1,000 years, the walls of Constantinople had stood as an unbroken shield. Built in the early 5th century, under Emperor Theodosius II, these mighty stone ramparts had repelled sieges by Avars, Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, and countless others. They were the pride of the city and its last great hope. Stretching over 5 kilometers across the landward side of the city, the Theodosian walls were a marvel of military architecture. A broad moat fronted a towering outer wall, behind which rose the massive inner wall, thick, crenellated, and reinforced with towers at regular intervals. For generations, these walls had made Constantinople nearly impregnable. Now, in the spring of 1453, they would be tested as never before. Sultan Mehmed II gathered a vast army, estimated at over 80,000 men, and brought with him a new and fearsome weapon: artillery. Chief among his siege guns was the Great Bombard, a massive cannon capable of hurling stone projectiles against the strongest fortifications. Designed by the Hungarian engineer Orban, the bombard was a symbol of the new age of warfare, an age where stone alone might no longer suffice. Inside the city, Emperor Constantine Palaiologus prepared for the siege. His forces numbered perhaps 7,000 Greek soldiers, Genoese allies, and a few determined volunteers from across Europe. They faced overwhelming odds, but their resolve was firm. Along the length of the Theodosian walls, defenders made ready. They repaired weakened sections, stockpiled arrows and stones, and braced themselves for the trials to come. Citizens of Constantinople, young and old, joined in the preparations. Priests led prayers in Hagia Sophia, their chants rising through the great dome like a plea to heaven. On April 6, 1453, the Ottoman siege began. Day after day, the bombard fired its thunderous shots, shaking the earth and battering the ancient walls. The defenders worked tirelessly to repair breaches by night, even as exhaustion and fear gnawed at their strength. For 7 weeks, the siege continued. The defenders held firm, their courage undimmed. Yet the walls, once thought invincible, now bore deep scars. And beyond the battered ramparts, Mehmed's forces prepared for a final assault. The fate of the empire hung in the balance. The last emperor. In the dim hours before dawn on May 29, 1453, the final chapter of Byzantium was written. Within the palace, Emperor Constantine V donned his armor, a simple suit of steel, worn with the dignity of his ancient office. He was the last emperor of Rome, the heir to a line that stretched back to Augustus. Now, he would lead his people in their darkest hour. The assault began with the first light of day. Waves of Ottoman soldiers surged against the shattered walls. The defenders fought with desperate valor, hurling stones, shooting arrows, wielding swords in hand-to-hand combat. Among them, Constantine fought as one of their own, no longer an emperor above, but a warrior beside. Through the chaos and smoke, the defenders held as long as they could. Yet the weight of numbers, the relentless pounding of the bombard, and the exhaustion of weeks under siege could not be overcome. Breaches opened in the walls. Ottoman troops poured through. The streets of Constantinople, once filled with the sounds of prayer and commerce, now echoed with the clash of steel and the cries of the fallen. Amid the final stand, Constantine was last seen near the gate of St. Romanus, sword in hand, fighting alongside his men. His body was never conclusively identified, but legend holds that he perished as an emperor should, at the heart of the defense, refusing to flee or surrender. By midday, the city had fallen. Mehmed II entered Hagia Sophia, where he ordered that it be converted into a mosque. The age of Byzantium had come to an end, yet even in defeat, something endured. The legacy of Byzantium, its art, its learning, its faith, would live on, carried by those who escaped, preserved in the memory of Orthodox peoples, and echoed in the Renaissance that would soon unfold in the West. As night fell over the conquered city, the stars still shone above the Bosphorus. The empire had passed into history, but its story would remain, etched into stone, sung in liturgy, and whispered through the long corridors of time. Chapter 10: Echoes of Byzantium. When Constantinople's great walls finally gave way in 1453, and the city fell beneath the banners of the Ottoman Turks, it seemed to mark the twilight of a long and storied empire. Yet the true legacy of Byzantium did not die with its walls. Instead, it flowed outward, carried on the words, the art, and the learning that Byzantines had long protected. One of Byzantium's most enduring contributions was the preservation of ancient knowledge. From its founding, Constantinople had served as a great center of scholarship. In its libraries and monasteries, Greek and Roman texts had been read, copied, and cherished through centuries of upheaval. In a world where much of the West had lost touch with classical wisdom, Byzantium had safeguarded the writings of Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, and countless others. Byzantine scholars did not merely preserve these works, they engaged with them. Philosophers debated their meanings. Scientists extended their inquiries. Historians expanded the chronicles of human experience. From astronomy to medicine to ethics, Byzantine learning represented a living dialogue with the past. When the empire finally fell, many of its most gifted minds fled westward. They carried with them precious manuscripts and deep wells of understanding. These refugees found welcome in the courts and universities of Renaissance Italy. There, their presence helped ignite a cultural rebirth. The classical revival that swept Europe was not born from nothing. It was, in large part, a gift from the fallen empire of Byzantium. Without the patient efforts of Byzantine scribes and scholars, much of the ancient world's wisdom might have been lost forever. In this way, even in its final hour, the empire fulfilled a noble role, that of guardian and messenger, passing the light of knowledge to new generations. The Orthodox Faith, yet beyond its intellectual gifts, Byzantium bequeathed something even more enduring, its spiritual heritage. For over 1,000 years, the Eastern Orthodox faith had been the soul of the empire. It shaped not only the daily lives of its people, but also the very identity of Byzantium itself. At the heart of this faith stood the Hagia Sophia, whose vast dome seemed to gather heaven and earth into one sacred space. The liturgies sung beneath, its arches, the shimmering icons that lined its walls, these were not mere ornaments. They were expressions of a profound and living tradition. Orthodoxy emphasized the mystical presence of the divine. In its prayers and rituals, it offered a sense of timeless connection with the sacred. This spiritual life nourished the hearts of Byzantines through centuries of triumph and hardship alike. Even after the fall of the city, the Orthodox Church endured. Though subject to new rulers, it remained a source of strength and identity. And beyond the former empire's borders, its influence had already spread far and wide. Missionaries from Byzantium had carried the Orthodox faith deep into Slavic lands. In Bulgaria, Serbia, and most enduringly in Russia, they planted seeds that would flourish for centuries. The Cyrillic alphabet, born from this mission, still serves as a vessel for Orthodox thought and scripture. To this day, the Eastern Orthodox Church bears the imprint of Byzantium. Its theology, its liturgical practices, its art, all carry echoes of the empire that gave them shape. In candlelit cathedrals and humble chapels alike, the voice of Byzantium still sings, quiet but unwavering. The law of Justinian. Among Byzantium's many legacies, one stands out for its lasting influence on the practical workings of the modern world. The law of Justinian. In the 6th century, Emperor Justinian III recognized that Rome's vast legal tradition had become a tangle of contradictions and outdated rulings. Determined to restore order and clarity, he launched an ambitious project, the codification of Roman law. Under the guidance of his legal scholars, Justinian's government produced the Corpus Juris Civilis, or body of civil law. This monumental compilation distilled centuries of legal thought into a coherent and accessible system. The Justinian Code did more than organize laws. It articulated foundational principles. It upheld the notion that the law must be transparent and consistent, that justice should serve the common good, and that rulers themselves were bound by the rule of law. Though created for Byzantium, the Code's influence reached far beyond the empire. In medieval Europe, it became the cornerstone of legal education. The scholars of Bologna and other great universities pored over its pages, and in doing so, helped shape the legal traditions of the emerging European states. Even today, echoes of Justinian's Code can be found in the civil law systems of many nations. Its spirit lives on in the idea that law is not merely a tool of power, but a guardian of fairness and order. Through this legacy, the voice of Byzantium continues to speak in courtrooms and legal texts around the world. The city eternal. And finally, there is the city itself, Constantinople. Though its name has changed and new empires have claimed its walls, the city on the Bosphorus remains one of the most storied places on earth. For centuries, it stood as the queen of cities, a crossroads of cultures, a bridge between East and West, a jewel of architecture and faith. Writers and artists, travelers and dreamers have long been captivated by its story. Its great domes rising against the sky, its ancient streets winding through layers of history, its shimmering waters glistening beneath the stars, all evoke a sense of timeless wonder. Why does the story of Constantinople endure? Perhaps because it embodies both the heights and the fragility of human achievement. Here was a city that withstood siege after siege, that fostered unmatched beauty in art and architecture, that served as a beacon of learning and faith. And yet, like all human endeavors, it too faced loss and transformation. In this story, we find a reflection of our own hopes and struggles. The tale of Constantinople reminds us that even amidst change and adversity, the spirit of what has been can endure. The stones of the city may crumble, but its memory shines ever bright. Today, as we walk its ancient streets, gaze upon the soaring arches of the Hagia Sophia, or watch the waters of the Bosphorus flow beneath the bridges of Istanbul, we stand in the presence of history. The echoes of Byzantium are all around us. In the beauty of its art, the wisdom of its laws, the faith of its churches, and the enduring fascination it inspires. The empire may have passed into the pages of history, but in truth, Byzantium never truly vanished. It lives on, in books and icons, in the rhythms of liturgy, in the principles of justice, and in the timeless allure of the Queen of Cities. Its voice still whispers, inviting us to listen, to remember, and to dream. Chapter 11. The World Within the Walls. The city of Constantinople stood like a jewel upon the earth, its vast walls rising from the waters where Europe kissed Asia. Beyond those towering fortifications, life unfolded in rhythms both ancient and ever-changing. The streets were paved with stones smoothed by centuries of footsteps. Great arches loomed overhead, their edges catching the golden light that poured from the sun-drenched sky. Amid these arteries of stone, the heart of the Byzantine Empire beat on. The markets of Constantinople were a living theatre of trade and colour. Beneath broad canopies, merchants called out in a chorus of languages: Greek, Latin, Arabic, Armenian. Their stalls overflowed with silks that shimmered like water, spices that perfumed the air, and finely crafted icons glinting with gold leaf. Fishermen brought fresh catch from the Bosphorus, while artisans sold delicate glassware and enamel that seemed spun from light itself. Above this bustle rose the domes and spires of a city shaped by faith and empire. The Hagia Sophia stood as its soul, its vast dome floating as if upon a sea of light. Nearby, slender minarets and the bell towers of smaller churches reached skyward. The soundscape was rich, the clang of blacksmiths, the melodies of street musicians, the solemn tolling of bells calling the faithful to prayer. The city's rhythm changed with the passing of each day. At dawn, the gates of the city opened, and a wave of farmers and traders entered, their carts creaking beneath sacks of grain, amphorae of oil, and baskets of fruit. By midday, the forums and squares thrummed with the heat of commerce. As twilight approached, torches flickered along narrow lanes, and the shadows of history seemed to walk beside the living. In this mosaic of life, architecture served as both canvas and stage. The great palace dazzled with marble halls, frescoes of imperial triumphs, and gardens where peacocks wandered. The Hippodrome stood as a colosseum of passion, its chariot races drawing crowds whose cheers echoed like waves against the city's stone heart. Even the smallest neighborhood bore its character, each a pocket of this grand layered world, where the past and present intermingled beneath Constantinople's ageless sky. Life behind the veil, within this gleaming world, life behind the walls of homes and palaces held its own intricate rhythms. In Byzantine society, a woman's role was both essential and veiled, her life unfolding within carefully defined spaces. The domus, the family household, was a universe unto itself. Here, within shaded courtyards and rooms adorned with icons, women wove the fabric of family and tradition. Marriage was a solemn bond, often arranged to strengthen family ties or advance social standing. From a young age, girls were taught the arts of household management, weaving, embroidery, and the preparation of sacred and daily meals. In wealthier homes, women managed estates, oversaw servants, and served as stewards of family honor. Yet, public life offered few avenues for their voice. The strict codes of propriety dictated that elite women rarely ventured alone into the bustling streets. And yet, within the home, they wielded quiet influence. They nurtured children, ensuring the next generation carried the values of the faith and the empire. They tended to the sick, preserved family histories, and engaged in acts of piety that anchored daily life. Religious devotion often provided a bridge beyond the household. Women played vital roles in monastic life, with many retreating to convents where they pursued scholarship, copied sacred texts, and offered prayers for the world beyond their cloistered walls. Even within the imperial court, where power seemed the domain of emperors and generals, women shaped destiny from behind the veil. Empresses such as Theodora proved that within the Byzantine world, a strong will and a wise heart could command influence unseen but deeply felt. Through whispered counsel and strategic alliances, they helped steer the great ship of state across the turbulent seas of history. Thus, behind the outward splendor of Constantinople, countless unseen hands shaped the empire's soul. The life of Byzantine women was often hidden from the city's grand stage. Yet it was upon this quiet foundation that much of the empire's enduring strength was built. Ritual and power. Within the imperial heart of Constantinople, ceremony was a language of its own, a theater of power designed to elevate the emperor above the mortal realm. Each gesture, each garment, each word of the courtly rites spoke volumes about divine right and worldly majesty. The emperor was more than a ruler. He was the living image of God's order upon earth. This belief was woven into every thread of imperial ritual. When the emperor appeared in public, it was as if a figure from heaven had descended, draped in robes heavy with gold and jewels, his crown gleaming with sacred gems. He moved beneath a canopy held aloft by noble hands. Trumpets blared, incense clouded the air, and the people prostrated themselves as if before an icon come to life. Inside the great palace, the rituals grew even more intricate. In the throne room, the emperor sat beneath a vast mosaic of Christ Pantocrator, a reminder that his power flowed from above. Courtiers approached with elaborate bows and phrases, honed by centuries of protocol. The very walls seemed to breathe the weight of history and expectation. Coronation ceremonies were among the most sacred spectacles. Within the Hagia Sophia, the emperor stood before the patriarch, who anointed him with holy oil, marking the moment when divine grace touched imperial authority. The ceremony was not merely for the court, but for the entire empire. It affirmed the sacred bond between ruler and ruled. Even in moments of diplomacy, ritual served as an unspoken language. Envoys from distant lands marveled at the splendor of the Byzantine court. Gifts were exchanged with solemn choreography. Banquets unfolded like living pageants, where music, dance, and elaborate dishes spoke of an empire steeped in both refinement and power. These rituals were more than mere display. They reinforced the Byzantine vision of the cosmos, where emperor, church, and people each played their ordained role. Through ceremony, the empire proclaimed its unbroken link to a higher order, a light amid the shifting shadows of the medieval world. The heartbeat of faith. At the core of Byzantine life pulsed an unceasing rhythm of faith. In Constantinople, the sacred was not confined to temples or cloisters. It wove through every street, every home, every hour of the day. Monasteries dotted the cityscape like oases of devotion. These were places where time slowed and the soul reached upward. Monks and nuns followed the cycle of prayer, their voices rising in ancient chants that seemed to dissolve the walls between earth and heaven. They tended gardens, copied holy texts, and offered shelter to the poor and weary. Their lives stood as living icons, reflections of a deeper, unseen reality. Icons themselves played a vital role in the spiritual life of the people. These painted windows into the divine adorned homes, churches, and public spaces. They were not mere art, but channels of presence, points where the faithful could touch the mysteries of their faith. Before an icon, a candle might flicker beside a whispered prayer, binding the soul to the vast communion of saints. Sacred processions brought this faith into the heart of the city. On feast days, the streets transformed into rivers of devotion. Clergy, in shimmering vestments, led the way, bearing crosses, icons, and relics through the crowd-lined avenues. Bells tolled in joyous chorus. Citizens, from humble craftsmen to noble courtiers, joined the procession, their voices lifted in song. These moments reminded all that the city itself was a vessel of the sacred, a living expression of the Christian world. Even in the flow of ordinary life, faith shaped each breath. Daily prayers framed the passage of time. The sign of the cross accompanied acts both great and small. Festivals marked the seasons, blending joy and reverence in celebrations that mirrored the eternal cycle of death and resurrection. In Constantinople, the divine was never distant. It dwelled in stone and song, in the silence of monasteries and the clamor of the market. The empire's spiritual heartbeat was steady and strong, a timeless current that carried the city forward through the ages. Chapter 12: Diplomacy and Deception. In the long shadow of Constantinople's golden domes, the Byzantine Empire forged not only swords and spears, but also words that could turn kings, divide armies, and shift the tide of empires without the clash of steel. For centuries, while armies marched across the frontiers, a quieter war unfolded in courts, across distant lands and beneath sealed scrolls. This was the realm of Byzantine diplomacy, a subtle, complex art that proved as decisive as any battlefield triumph. The empire, born from the fading embers of Rome, faced a precarious world. To the east, Persians and later Arabs sought conquest. To the north, waves of Slavs and Bulgars pressed southward. In the west, jealous European powers eyed the riches of Constantinople. Yet against these forces, Byzantium wielded its greatest shield: cunning diplomacy. Byzantine envoys were trained not only in languages and protocol, but in reading the hearts of men. They could flatter a barbarian chieftain, charm a Latin bishop, or sow mistrust between rival lords. Their missions were not simply to deliver messages, but to observe, influence, and gather intelligence. Every handshake, every banquet, every whispered conversation held layers of meaning. In the empire's chancery, records were meticulously kept of the customs, weaknesses, and ambitions of foreign rulers. When negotiating, Byzantine diplomats often knew more about their counterparts than the counterparts knew about themselves. They would craft offers that appealed to pride, greed, or fear, whichever lever best opened the desired door. Unlike the brute force employed by many of its neighbors, Byzantium preferred to win wars with ink and gold. Treaties, not conquests, expanded its influence. Enemies were turned into allies, invaders into clients, and where force was required, it was often preceded by a web of alliances and deceptions that weakened the foe before a single sword was drawn. This mastery of words shaped the empire's fate for centuries. When empires around it rose and fell, Byzantium endured, its diplomats moving as unseen architects behind the scenes of European and Eastern courts. Gold over steel. If words were the empire's first weapon, gold was its second. The Byzantines understood that money could achieve what armies sometimes could not. In a world where loyalty was often for sale, the empire was a master of paying the right price at the right time. Bribes were neither shameful nor hidden. They were an accepted tool of statecraft. When nomadic tribes threatened the Balkans, gold was dispatched not to fund defenses, but to convince one tribe to fight another, or to lure them into alliance. When Slavic leaders approached the imperial borders, they often found imperial gifts more persuasive than imperial armies. Strategic marriages, too, served the empire's aims. Imperial daughters were married to foreign kings and princes, binding distant courts to Constantinople with ties of family. These unions often came with lavish dowries and promises of imperial favor. Through such marriages, Byzantium projected influence far beyond its military reach. One famed example involved the marriage of Princess Anna Porphyrogenita to Vladimir the Great of Kiev. In exchange, Vladimir agreed to convert to Christianity and to baptize his people, thus securing a powerful religious and political alliance. Byzantium's spiritual and cultural influence flowed northward, carried on the rivers of gold and the bonds of marriage. At times, even enemies within the empire were neutralized with payments. A would-be usurper might be quietly enriched in exchange for abandoning his cause. Rebel generals might be granted estates and titles to buy their loyalty. The empire's treasury thus served not only to fund defense, but to shape the political landscape with invisible threads. Through this judicious use of gold and marriage, Byzantium preserved fragile frontiers and manipulated the ambitions of friend and foe alike. In many cases, the empire survived crises not because it outfought its enemies, but because it outpaid or outplanned them. The craft of the Chancery. Behind the grand diplomacy of emperors and envoys stood a quieter, more hidden engine, the imperial chancery. Here, in candlelit halls within Constantinople's great palace, scribes, scholars, and secretaries labored over the words that would shape empires. The imperial chancery was a world apart, its officials sworn to secrecy and trained in the precise art of drafting imperial correspondence. Each word, each phrase was carefully chosen to convey meaning while leaving room for interpretation. The language of diplomacy was as much about what was unsaid as what was written. Coded letters were common. Byzantium developed complex cipher systems to protect sensitive communications. Envoys often traveled with hidden messages that could only be read by trusted imperial eyes. The Chancery also maintained detailed records of foreign courts, enabling scribes to tailor correspondence to each ruler's preferences, prejudices, and ambitions. Scribes were also artists of flattery. A letter from the emperor might open with flowery praise, extolling a barbarian king's wisdom or valor, carefully designed to soothe pride and encourage cooperation. Conversely, subtle warnings or veiled threats could be woven into even the most polite phrases. The work of the Chancery extended to ceremony. The reception of foreign envoys in Constantinople was choreographed with meticulous attention to protocol. The order of greetings, the seating at banquets, even the choice of clothing worn by imperial officials, all conveyed signals of status and intent. Diplomacy was theatre as well as substance. One notable example was the so-called Book of Ceremonies, a manual compiled under Emperor Constantine VII. It outlined in extraordinary detail the rituals and protocols of the imperial court, ensuring that every interaction with foreign dignitaries reinforced Byzantium's prestige and authority. Through the craft of its chancery, the empire spoke with 1,000 voices, charming, warning, allying, deceiving. It was an art form that, though unseen by most, played a decisive role in the survival and influence of Byzantium for centuries. An empire's reputation. Over time, the Byzantine mastery of diplomacy became legend and sometimes infamy. In the courts of Europe and the East, to describe something as Byzantine came to mean complex, secretive, even treacherous. Yet this reputation, though tinged with criticism, also reflected a deep respect for the empire's brilliance. Byzantine diplomacy was not born from weakness, but from necessity. Surrounded by larger and often more aggressive powers, the empire could not rely on force alone. Intrigue became its shield, subtlety its sword. To survive, it had to outthink and outmaneuver its foes. Many foreign observers marveled at the empire's ability to play rivals against one another. Crusader leaders, visiting Constantinople on their way to the Holy Land, found themselves enveloped in a web of flattery, gifts, and careful manipulation. Eastern ambassadors often returned home convinced of Byzantine superiority, not through defeat in battle, but through the persuasive power of its court. Yet, there was a cost to this reputation. Some allies came to distrust Byzantine intentions, wary of hidden motives behind every treaty. The empire's diplomats walked a fine line, balancing charm with credibility, persuasion with trust. Still, the legacy of Byzantine diplomacy is one of enduring brilliance. Few empires in history managed to endure for 1,000 years. Fewer still did so while navigating such a treacherous geopolitical landscape. That Byzantium survived so long owed much to its armies and walls, but just as much to its unmatched skill in the arts of words, gold, and subtle influence. In the quiet halls of its chancery, and in the whispered councils of its envoys, Byzantium shaped the world with a power that no sword could match. And though the empire is long gone, the word Byzantine remains, a testament to a diplomacy so intricate, so enduring, that it became a legend in its own right. Chapter 13: Silk and Spice. There was a time when the city of Constantinople shimmered, not just with golden domes and marble halls, but with the soft rustle of silks and the fragrant breath of faraway spices. At the meeting point of continents, where Europe reached toward Asia and the great seas kissed the land, Constantinople became a living bridge between worlds. Long after the Roman Empire faded in the West, this eastern capital thrived, its wealth flowing in not from conquest alone, but from trade. Ships docked in its harbors from Alexandria and Antioch, from Venice and Trebizond. Caravans wound their way through Anatolian passes and down the Silk Road. Each brought treasures both humble and rare. Goods traveled vast and perilous distances, over mountains where snow never melted, through deserts where winds whispered of ancient kingdoms, along rivers that cut deep into forested lands. Merchants came. They carried bolts of fine silk that caught the light like water. They carried cinnamon and cardamom, cloves and nutmeg, harvested from distant groves where few Byzantines would ever walk. They brought ivory and gold from Africa, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, fine steel from India, and porcelain from the lands of the rising sun. In Constantinople, these wonders met. The city's markets and warehouses became a treasury of the world. The streets thrummed with languages: Greek, Latin, Arabic, Persian, Armenian, Slavic. The merchants knew that here, in this imperial capital, buyers awaited with open purses and eager eyes. Wealthy nobles and imperial agents came to choose goods for their palaces. Skilled artisans sought rare materials to shape into beautiful things. Even common folk might catch a glimpse of some marvel, a spice they had never smelled before, or a bolt of cloth so fine it seemed unearthly. The Byzantine emperors understood this flow of trade was lifeblood. They maintained the city's famed harbors and guarded its roads. They ensured that tolls and tariffs swelled the imperial treasury, and they carefully controlled certain commodities, silk chief among them. Over centuries, this gateway between worlds kept Byzantium rich when kingdoms around it faltered. Through wars and plagues, through the rise of new powers, the empire endured, in no small part because its markets never ceased to hum. The secret of the silkworm, of all the treasures that passed through Constantinople. Silk was the most coveted. Its threads gleamed with an inner light, soft as a whisper, yet stronger than iron of equal weight. For centuries, the art of silk making remained a closely guarded secret of the Chinese. They alone knew how to cultivate the tiny silkworms and harvest their shimmering cocoons. The West could only buy the finished cloth at staggering cost, but the Byzantines longed for more than trade. They sought mastery. It was during the reign of Emperor Justinian in the 6th century that a daring plan unfolded. Stories tell of two monks, men who had traveled as missionaries to the east. In distant lands, they observed the ancient craft of sericulture. They saw the mulberry trees whose leaves fed the worms, the careful unwinding of cocoon into thread. They learned too that the silkworm's eggs might be transported if kept cool. When these monks returned to Constantinople, they carried a precious secret, hidden within hollowed-out bamboo canes. Inside were silkworm eggs, their fragile life suspended by careful handling. With imperial support, the eggs hatched. Mulberry groves were planted, and the silkworms were tended in guarded workshops. The techniques of spinning, dyeing, and weaving were studied and mastered. Soon, Constantinople no longer merely bought silk, it produced it. The imperial silk workshops created cloth fit for emperors and foreign kings. Byzantine silk, with its vivid dyes and intricate patterns, became prized across Christendom and beyond. The state controlled its production tightly, ensuring that only select merchants and officials could sell the cloth. Revenues poured into the empire's coffers, and Byzantine diplomatic gifts often included rolls of shimmering silk, a currency of prestige. The smuggling of those tiny eggs altered the empire's fate. What began as a daring mission grew into an industry that helped sustain Byzantium for centuries. From the courts of Aachen to the palaces of Baghdad, the silk of Constantinople was a symbol of both beauty and imperial power. Markets of marvels. To walk through the markets of Constantinople was to step into a world of wonders. The city's greatest bazaar spread beneath the shadow of Hagia Sophia, its stalls and arcades winding like a labyrinth. Here, the air was thick with scents, incense burning in tiny braziers, the sharp tang of citrus, the sweetness of dried dates, the deep musk of spices still trapped within their wooden casks. Silk hung in cascades from shaded awnings, deep crimson, royal purple, emerald green. Some bore the golden threads of imperial looms. Merchants from Persia displayed carpets woven with ancient symbols. Traders from Arabia brought rare perfumes in small glass vials. Ivory carvings gleamed beside brass lamps. From the far reaches of India came baskets filled with pepper, cloves, and cardamom, spices so precious that wars had been fought for them. The voices of the market rose in a polyglot chorus. Greek street hawkers shouted their wares. Armenian jewelers beckoned passers-by to admire their treasures. Slavic traders haggled over prices of fur and wax. Latin-speaking agents from Venice negotiated contracts with practiced ease. The empire's Jewish merchants, skilled in finance, facilitated deals that crossed religious and cultural lines. The market was not only a place for goods, but for stories. Travelers brought news of distant kingdoms. Sailors spoke of pirate raids and strange sea creatures. Pilgrims recounted visions and miracles. Amid the flow of trade, ideas traveled too. Artistic styles, religious thought, scientific knowledge. Constantinople's markets became as much a meeting of minds as of merchants. In these bustling streets, the empire's greatness was made visible. The wealth of distant lands lay beneath Byzantine skies. And though emperors ruled from high palaces, it was here, in the daily dance of commerce, that Constantinople's heart truly beat. The wealth of empire trade did more than enrich individual merchants. It sustained the empire itself. Taxes on imports and exports filled the imperial treasury. Toll stations on roads and waterways ensured that even the smallest caravan contributed to state revenues. The emperors levied duties on luxury goods, silk, spices, gemstones, turning desire into wealth. With these funds, Byzantium financed its splendor. The great domes of Constantinople were clad in gold and mosaics. Palaces were adorned with marble and porphyry. Scholars and artists found patronage at the imperial court. Military campaigns were launched with coin drawn from the market's bounty. Even during lean years, trade helped soften the blows of war and plague. Yet commerce also demanded vigilance. The empire worked tirelessly to protect its trade routes. Fortresses guarded key mountain passes. Naval patrols secured the sea lanes. Diplomatic treaties opened new paths for merchants. At times, the empire's very survival hinged on its ability to maintain this flow of wealth. When hostile powers blocked the eastern routes, Byzantium sought new channels. When Italian city-states grew powerful, emperors negotiated shrewdly to preserve their own market share. Through triumph and trial, the empire adapted. Silk production became an imperial monopoly, with strict oversight to prevent foreign rivals from learning its secrets. Spices remained a prized import, their cost offset by the export of fine cloth and crafted goods. The gold solidus, Byzantium's stable coin, became a trusted currency across the known world, its reliability underpinned by the trade that sustained it. In the end, it was not only soldiers or emperors who preserved Byzantium across centuries of change. It was also the steady rhythm of commerce, the ships that sailed from Alexandria, the caravans that crossed Anatolia, the merchants who braved distant roads. Silk and spice, gold and gems, these were the lifelines of an empire that glittered against the tides of history. As the sun set over Constantinople and the call to evening prayers echoed from its towers, the markets grew quiet. Stalls were shuttered, goods secured. Yet beneath the city's sleeping stones, the pulse of trade continued. For in the great tapestry of Byzantium's story, commerce was a thread that bound all things together. Chapter 14: Masters of the Sea. The early Byzantine Empire understood one truth above all others: the sea was both a gift and a threat. From the time of Constantine the Great, the waters around Constantinople gleamed not only with beauty but with danger. Across the vast expanse of the Mediterranean, rival powers, pirates, and hostile fleets sailed with ambitions that could reach the very gates of the imperial city. The Byzantine rulers, inheriting the fragmented remnants of Rome's once mighty navy, faced a harsh lesson. Without command of the sea, their empire would be but an island adrift. It was in these moments of early uncertainty that the Byzantine navy began to take shape. The first great challenge came with waves of Arab expansion in the 7th century. New fleets emerged from Egypt and Syria, threatening to sweep across the eastern Mediterranean. In response, Emperor Constantine II and his successors understood they had to transform their naval forces from scattered provincial squadrons into a unified, purposeful arm of imperial power. Shipyards in Constantinople and the Aegean islands echoed with the clang of hammers and the scent of freshly hewn timber. The dromon, a sleek, fast galley, became the backbone of the fleet. With long, narrow hulls and banks of oars, these ships could outpace many of their adversaries. Above all, they could be built and deployed quickly to meet the empire's evolving needs. Naval organization also advanced. The emperor established the office of the Drungarios tou Ploimo, or Admiral of the Fleet, giving central command to seasoned officers. The navy became a shield for the empire's merchant routes, a bulwark against raids, and a spear pointed at any who dared challenge Byzantine dominance on the water. Through this crucible of crisis, a new force was born, a navy forged not by ambition alone, but by the urgent need to survive. Greek fire unleashed. Among the many tools the Byzantines developed to hold their fragile empire together, none inspired more fear or fascination than Greek fire. Its origin remains cloaked in mystery, its formula one of the most closely guarded secrets in history. What is known is that sometime in the 7th century, during the reign of Emperor Constantine IV, the Byzantines acquired a weapon that would change naval warfare forever. Greek fire was no ordinary incendiary. It was a liquid that burned fiercely, even upon the surface of water. Some say it hissed like a living serpent when ignited, clinging to the hulls of enemy ships with a dreadful tenacity. Those struck by it knew that water offered no escape. Instead, the flames would spread faster, consuming wood, sailcloth, and flesh alike. Mounted on siphon-like devices fixed to the prows of dromons, Greek fire could be unleashed in bursts upon approaching enemy fleets. The sight of Byzantine ships advancing with their mysterious nozzles and the sudden eruption of unnatural flame turned many a battle before a single blade was drawn. Panic rippled through enemy ranks. Captains abandoned ships. Rowers leapt into the sea, only to be swallowed by the same relentless fire. The weapon's secrecy became a state obsession. Only trusted members of the emperor's inner circle and a select corps of naval engineers knew the formula. Even as centuries passed and emperors rose and fell, this knowledge remained protected. The empire's enemies, from Arab fleets to, later, Latin crusaders, tried endlessly to replicate Greek fire. None succeeded. Its first dramatic use came during the Arab sieges of Constantinople in the late 7th and early 8th centuries. Arab fleets, confident in their numbers, found themselves routed as columns of Byzantine fire streamed across the water. Time and again, Greek fire would serve as the empire's silent guardian, preserving Constantinople from maritime assault. In an age when brute force often decided the fate of empires, Greek fire gave Byzantium a weapon of mythic power, one that turned the tide of battle and earned the navy a fearsome, near-magical reputation. Masters of the Bosphorus Strait, narrow, winding, and vital, served as both the lifeline and the fortress moat of Constantinople. Whoever controlled these waters controlled access to the Black Sea and safeguarded the imperial capital. For centuries, the Byzantine navy honed strategies to ensure this slender channel remained under their command. The geography of the Bosphorus itself offered both opportunity and peril. Strong currents and treacherous winds favored those who knew its secrets. The Byzantines did. With vigilant patrols and fortified anchorages along its banks, they turned the strait into a maritime chessboard where foreign fleets dared not move rashly. Booming chains were another key to their mastery. In times of siege, massive iron chains were drawn across the Golden Horn, the sheltered inlet forming the northern boundary of the city. Stretched between the fortress of Galata and the city walls, this barrier denied enemy ships entry, forcing them to remain exposed to naval fire or risk grounding upon the shore. The placement of watchtowers and signal beacons ensured that no enemy vessel could slip through unnoticed. From the heights of the city's sea walls, observers kept constant vigil, ready to summon the fleet at the first sign of intrusion. Byzantine dromons, stationed at key points along the Bosphorus, could respond swiftly, using their speed and maneuverability to outflank and harass larger invading forces. Time after time, these tactics proved decisive. During the Great Arab Sieges, and later during the incursions of the Rus, the empire's grip on the Bosphorus held firm. Even when land forces threatened Constantinople from beyond the walls, the navy ensured that the sea remained an unbroken line of defense. Supplies, reinforcements, and hope flowed through the strait, sustaining the besieged city. To be a master of the Bosphorus was to be a master of Constantinople's fate. In the hands of the Byzantine navy, this mastery endured for centuries, a silent testament to discipline, foresight, and an unyielding will to protect the imperial heart. Tides of change. No power remains unchallenged forever. As the centuries turned, so too did the fortunes of the Byzantine navy. Its story mirrors the broader rhythms of the empire, moments of dazzling strength followed by periods of painful decline. In the empire's golden ages, the navy ruled the eastern Mediterranean with unmatched skill. Under the great Macedonian emperors of the 9th and 10th centuries, fleets carried imperial banners far beyond the Bosphorus. They struck at pirate strongholds, secured trade routes, and extended Byzantine influence into distant seas. The navy was not merely a shield, but a sword wielded with precision. Yet with success came complacency. In the later 11th century, internal strife, economic pressures, and the shifting priorities of emperors led to neglect. As the land armies demanded more resources, the navy withered. New enemies emerged: the Normans in the west, the Seljuk Turks in the east, and the Byzantines found their naval power insufficient to meet every challenge. The arrival of the Fourth Crusade in 1204 marked a devastating blow. The Venetian fleet, masters of maritime commerce and warfare, outmaneuvered what remained of the imperial navy. When Constantinople fell to the Latins, the empire's proud maritime tradition seemed broken, yet the sea remained woven into Byzantium's destiny. In the empire's final centuries, though much diminished, the navy adapted once more. Smaller fleets, focused on local control and agile defense, maintained vital lifelines for the shrinking imperial territories. The empire could no longer project force as before, but it could still survive, in part thanks to its enduring connection to the sea. When the end came in 1453, it came not through failure at sea, but through the overwhelming force of Ottoman land power. Even in those final days, Byzantine ships patrolled the Bosphorus, ferrying supplies and offering the last threads of resistance. The spirit of the navy, forged in ancient crises and tempered across ages, burned bright to the very end. Today, though, the empire is gone. The legacy of its seafarers lingers. In the quiet flow of the Bosphorus and the distant echoes of oars upon forgotten waves, one can still sense the presence of the masters of the sea, guardians of an empire that once ruled the waters between two worlds. Chapter 15. Saints and Scholars. There were places within the grand Byzantine Empire where silence was not the mark of absence, but of reverence. In the heart of Constantinople, beneath the dome of heaven that was Hagia Sophia and along streets, paved with the stones of countless generations, the pursuit of knowledge quietly thrived. Long after the clamor of soldiers faded and imperial decrees lost their power, these halls of learning would continue to shape the minds of future ages. At the center of this intellectual world stood the University of Constantinople, founded in 425 AD by Emperor Theodosius II. It was one of the oldest universities in Europe. Within its lecture halls, the wisdom of Aristotle and Plato, the sciences of Ptolemy and Galen, and the writings of the Church Fathers were taught side by side. It was a place where philosophy met theology, where logic tempered faith, and where the ancient and the divine mingled. Scholars gathered here to study grammar, rhetoric, philosophy, law, and medicine. The halls were alive with quiet footsteps and murmured discussions, parchment scrolls unrolled beneath lamplight, and the steady scratching of quills echoing softly in the still air. Knowledge was treated not as an ornament of the elite, but as a treasure to be preserved and passed on. Nearby, in the imperial palace and its libraries, rare manuscripts rested on carved wooden shelves tended by careful hands. Scribes copied ancient texts with patient devotion, aware that each stroke preserved a fragile thread of human memory. These collections, though vulnerable to war and fire, remained for centuries the richest in the Christian world. Even beyond the university, learning permeated the city. In monasteries and private homes, teachers instructed eager students. Women of noble birth, too, sometimes joined in these studies, contributing to the vibrant intellectual life of the empire. Knowledge was not limited by the strict walls of any one place. It was a living stream that flowed through the veins of Constantinople. The empire, though often surrounded by hostile forces and internal strife, looked inward to nurture a world of the mind. In doing so, Byzantium became more than a fortress of stone. It became a beacon of enlightenment, whose light would ripple outward through centuries to come. Keepers of the word. If the streets of Constantinople carried the noise of daily life, the monasteries of the Byzantine world held a deeper, quieter purpose. In these sanctuaries, monks became the keepers of the word, protectors of the written wisdom of the ancient world. Across the hills of Mount Athos, in Cappadocia's stone-hewn retreats, and in countless abbeys that dotted the empire, the task of preservation unfolded in slow, careful labor. A monk would rise in the dim light of dawn, offer prayers, and then sit at a wooden desk before a sheet of vellum. The task ahead was both holy and humble, to copy by hand the words of ages past. These monks understood that without their work, the knowledge of Plato, Aristotle, Hippocrates, and countless others might vanish. The fall of Rome had shattered many centers of learning in the West, but Byzantium stood as a bridge to antiquity. Here, in silent scriptoriums, the flame of classical knowledge was shielded against the winds of time. Their work required extraordinary patience. Each letter had to be perfect, each page free of error. Illuminated manuscripts, with their delicate gold and colored designs, were both works of art and vessels of wisdom. To hold such a book was to hold a fragile miracle, the thoughts of a long-dead philosopher made new through living hands. Beyond philosophy and science, monks preserved the scriptures and theological writings that defined the Christian faith. Texts of the Church Fathers, Basil the Great, Gregory of Nazianzus, John Chrysostom, were copied and recopied, ensuring their teachings would endure. The Bible itself, written in majestic Greek, was passed from generation to generation, its words unchanged. It was not an easy task. Wars swept through the empire. Invaders sacked cities. Fires destroyed libraries. Yet time and again, the monks returned to their work. When manuscripts were lost, they searched for copies in distant lands. When ink grew scarce, they made their own. When danger loomed, they hid their precious volumes in caves and secret vaults. Through these humble efforts, a vast portion of ancient Greek and Roman knowledge survived into the modern world. Without the hands of Byzantine scribes, much of what we now know of classical antiquity would have been lost to history. In this way, the monks served not only God, but all of humanity, guarding a priceless inheritance that would one day be reborn. The lives of saints. In a world often shaped by emperors and warriors, it was the saints who captured the hearts of the common people. Their lives, filled with faith, sacrifice, and miraculous deeds, offered hope and inspiration in a troubled world. Through stories passed by word of mouth and written in sacred texts, the saints of Byzantium became eternal figures in the spiritual landscape of the empire. Hagiography, the writing of saints' lives, was a beloved art in Byzantium. Monks and scholars carefully recorded tales of the holy men and women whose deeds seemed to bridge earth and heaven. These stories were not mere legends. They were living guides to virtue, faith, and divine power. Among the most venerated was Saint Basil the Great, whose compassion for the poor and profound theological writings shaped Christian charity for generations. His works taught that learning and faith must walk hand in hand, and that service to others was the truest form of worship. Saint John Chrysostom, known as the Golden-Mouthed, left behind sermons that stirred the soul. His eloquence called believers to humility and justice, reminding them that holiness was not reserved for the cloistered, but could be lived in daily life. The story of St. Simeon Stylites captured the imagination of many. This remarkable ascetic lived for decades atop a stone pillar, seeking closeness to God through a life of extreme devotion. Pilgrims traveled from distant lands to hear his words and witness his unwavering faith. Miracles also filled the lives of these saints. Blind. Men received sight. Barren fields yielded harvests. Storms were stilled through prayer. Whether one believed in such wonders or saw them as symbols of hope, they provided comfort to a people often beset by hardship. Icons, too, played a vital role in popular faith. These sacred images of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints adorned churches and homes. They were not mere decorations, but windows to the divine. Through prayer before an icon, the faithful felt a tangible connection to the holy figures who watched over them. Feast days brought entire communities together in joyful celebration. Processions filled the streets, incense wafted through the air, and hymns rose like gentle waves. In these moments, the empire's divisions of class and wealth seemed to fade, as all stood united before the saints' enduring light. In the lives of its saints, Byzantium found a living faith, one that transcended politics and war and reached into the hearts of its people. These stories, preserved through generations, continue to inspire the faithful to this day. A legacy of letters. While swords and shields defended Byzantium's borders, it was the pen that shaped its enduring legacy. The intellectual life of the Yeo Empire reached far beyond its walls, touching lands as distant as the Islamic caliphates and the kingdoms of medieval Europe. Byzantine scholars were bridges between worlds. As the empire preserved Greek and Roman knowledge, it also transmitted this wisdom to other cultures. The great works of philosophy, science, and medicine found their way into Arabic through translations commissioned by Islamic scholars. In cities like Baghdad, this knowledge sparked a golden age of learning that would influence the world for centuries. The philosopher Al-Kindi, the mathematician Al-Khwarizmi, and the physician Avicenna all drew upon texts preserved by Byzantium. In this way, the ancient wisdom of Athens and Alexandria traveled eastward, enriching Islamic thought and, in time, returning to Europe through Spain and Sicily. In medieval Europe too, Byzantine influence was profound. As Western scholars sought to revive classical learning during the Renaissance, they turned to the Greek manuscripts safeguarded by the empire. When Constantinople fell in 1453, many scholars fled west, carrying precious texts to Italy. There, their teachings helped ignite the rebirth of art, science, and philosophy that defined the Renaissance. Byzantine theology also shaped Christian thought beyond the empire's borders. Debates over the nature of Christ, the veneration of icons, and the writings of the Church Fathers influenced both Eastern Orthodoxy and Western Christianity. The empire's liturgical traditions, music, and spiritual practices spread throughout the Orthodox world and beyond. Even in language, Byzantium left its mark. The Greek used in the empire evolved but remained a living link to the language of Homer and Plato. Through their careful scholarship, Byzantine writers ensured that this ancient tongue would survive, carrying with it the wisdom of ages. As the centuries passed, the political power of Byzantium waned and its territories shrank, yet its intellectual legacy remained a beacon. The flame lit in Constantinople's libraries and monasteries continued to burn, guiding future generations in the pursuit of knowledge and faith. In the story of the Byzantine Empire, the saints and scholars stand as quiet giants. Their labor, devotion, and vision ensured that even as empires rose and fell, the light of wisdom would endure, a legacy written not in stone, but in the living word. Chapter 16. The Second Golden Age. There are times in history when greatness shrinks not in spirit, but in size. So it was with the Byzantine Empire under the Palaiologan emperors. Once a sprawling realm that stretched across continents, the empire had become a patchwork of fragile territories by the late Middle Ages. Yet within its slender borders, something remarkable stirred. A quiet flowering of art, thought, and culture that would become known as Byzantium's Second Golden Age. The year was 1261. After decades of exile following the Fourth Crusade, Michael VIII, Palaiologus recaptured Constantinople from the Latin occupiers. The city he entered was scarred and weary. Its grand forums were empty, its churches looted, its once proud walls battered. But within its broken heart, the flame of Byzantium still flickered. Michael VIII understood that political power alone could not revive the empire. If Byzantium was to endure, it must reclaim its role as a beacon of civilization. Though his resources were meager, he invested what he could into rebuilding the city's churches, libraries, and schools. The emperor's successors, too, embraced this vision. Even as the empire shrank further in the face of Turkish expansion and Western pressures, Constantinople became a sanctuary for learning and creativity. Byzantium in these years was an empire, in miniature, politically fragile, economically strained, yet its cultural life burned with an intensity that belied its diminished stature. The city's scholars, artists, and theologians poured their efforts into preserving and enriching the legacy of the ancient world. Across gilded manuscripts and flickering mosaics, through carefully copied texts and new philosophical dialogues, Byzantium whispered to the future. Visitors to late medieval Constantinople spoke of a city that seemed both ancient and strangely alive. Its streets bustled with artisans and merchants. Its churches gleamed with new icons. In the imperial court, emperors sponsored debates on Plato and Aristotle, as if the grandeur of Rome still lingered in the air. The empire's body had grown frail, but its mind and soul remained luminous. Palaiologan art. Among the most visible expressions of this second golden age was the art of Byzantium's final centuries. Despite economic hardship, the Palaiologan emperors and wealthy patrons continued to commission works of stunning beauty, creations that seemed to defy the gathering shadows around them. Architecture saw a gentle revival. Though new grand structures were rare, restorations breathed life into Constantinople's aging skyline. The Church of St. Mary of the Mongols, still standing today, was among the few built during this era, its domes and arches embodying the grace of Byzantine design. More often, existing churches were adorned with brilliant new mosaics and frescoes, creating jewel-box sanctuaries where light and color danced together. The mosaics of this period glowed with a softer, more intimate radiance than their earlier imperial predecessors. In the Chora Church, shimmering images of Christ and the Virgin Mary blend delicate emotion with profound spiritual presence. The gold tesserae catch the light like stars against the dim stone walls, inviting worshippers into moments of contemplation. This was art not of triumph, but of deep faith. Icons, too, reached new heights of expression. Painters developed subtler techniques, using translucent layers of color to evoke depth and humanity. The faces of saints and the Virgin gaze with compassion and quiet wisdom, bridging the divine and the mortal. In an age of uncertainty, these images offered a source of comfort and continuity. Byzantine art of the Palaiologan era often embraced the tension between earthly fragility and heavenly eternity. This was an art born of crisis, yet it affirmed the enduring beauty of the sacred. In every glowing mosaic, in every finely wrought icon, one could sense the resilience of a culture determined to shine, even as darkness gathered beyond the walls. Learning rekindled. If the visual arts embodied Byzantium's second golden age, so too did the realm of learning. Under the Palaiologus emperors, there was a conscious effort to revive and expand the intellectual traditions of the ancient Greek world. This renaissance of thought would ripple far beyond the empire's borders. The imperial court became a center for humanist inquiry. Scholars such as George Gemistus Plethen and Theodore Metachites studied and taught the works of Plato, Aristotle, and other classical philosophers. Their writings explored the nature of the soul, the cosmos, and ethics, weaving together Christian theology with ancient wisdom. Libraries were rebuilt and manuscripts copied with care. The surviving texts of Greek literature, philosophy, and science were preserved and disseminated, a labor that would later feed the intellectual awakening of Renaissance Europe. In this fragile corner of the medieval world, the torch of Greek learning burned brightly. Theologians, too, engaged in lively debate. The era witnessed renewed discussion on the relationship between Eastern Orthodoxy and Western Christianity. Though the hopes of church union would ultimately falter, these dialogues reflected a spirit of inquiry and engagement. Not all learning was confined to the elite. Schools attached to monasteries and churches educated a new generation in the art of rhetoric, philosophy, and theology. Young minds absorbed the teachings of the ancients alongside the mysteries of faith, preparing them to carry forward Byzantium's cultural inheritance. In the shadow of decline, this intellectual flowering was a triumph of the human spirit. The Palaiologan emperors understood that even as borders shifted and armies threatened, the life of the mind must endure. And endure it did. In lecture halls and libraries, in quiet study and spirited debate, Byzantium scholars laid the seeds for future generations to rediscover the wisdom of antiquity, art amidst ruin. As the 14th and 15th centuries unfolded, the Byzantine Empire faced mounting peril. The Ottomans advanced steadily across Asia Minor and the Balkans, surrounding Constantinople in a tightening grip. Trade declined, resources dwindled, and the once mighty city seemed poised on the brink of extinction. Yet amidst this gathering ruin, art and creativity continued to flourish. Perhaps it was the very awareness of fragility that fueled this late burst of expression, a desire to leave behind beauty that might outlast the empire itself. In small workshops across Constantinople, icon painters refined their craft to ever greater subtlety. They created images meant not for imperial display, but for private devotion, intimate works that spoke to the enduring faith of individuals. The icons of this period reveal a deep inwardness, a focus on the personal encounter with the divine. Manuscript illumination, too, saw a final flowering. Scribes and artists produced lavishly illustrated gospels and theological texts, their pages rich with gold leaf and intricate designs. Each stroke of the pen was an act of devotion, a quiet affirmation of meaning amid uncertainty. The city's churches, though often in disrepair, remained centers of communal life. Services continued. Under the glow of ancient lamps, voices rising in chant beneath crumbling domes, the liturgy itself became a living work of art, a ritual that bound past and present, earth and heaven. Even as the empire's political fortunes waned, its cultural spirit remained unbroken. In the final decades before Constantinople's fall, in 1453, artists and thinkers worked with a quiet urgency, aware that their world was slipping away, yet they chose not despair, but creation. And so, when the Ottoman banners finally flew over the city's walls, they conquered a realm whose true treasures could not be measured in land or coin. The art, learning, and faith of Byzantium had already transcended its shrinking borders, ready to inspire new worlds. Chapter 17. The Siege of 1453. The year was 1453, and the city of Constantinople stood as the last proud remnant of the once mighty Roman Empire. For more than 1,000 years, its walls had withstood all challenges. Now, the city faced its greatest threat. Across the Bosphorus, a young sultan named Mehmed II was gathering an army the likes of which the world had never seen. Only 21 years old, Mehmed burned with ambition. He saw Constantinople not as an old city to be honored, but as a jewel to be taken, a gateway to empire. In the months leading to spring, Mehmed's forces swelled. Soldiers came from every corner of his realm, Turks, Slavs, Greeks, and mercenaries, drawn by gold and glory. Among them were skilled engineers tasked with building massive new weapons. One man, the Hungarian master gunsmith Orban, brought forth a monstrous cannon. It was so large that dozens of oxen were needed to move it. The gun could hurl stone balls weighing more than 1,000 pounds. It would become the harbinger of doom for the ancient walls. Alongside this terrifying weapon, Mehmed prepared a fleet to blockade the city by sea. Chains across the Golden Horn could not fully shield the harbour. The Sultan planned to roll ships across land to bypass the barrier, an audacious move that would leave the defenders scrambling. Inside the Ottoman camp, a mood of destiny hung thick. Soldiers sharpened swords and arrows. Cannons were loaded and positioned. Mehmed himself visited the front lines daily, speaking to his men and urging them onward. In April, the army, perhaps over 80,000 strong, encircled the city. The Great Siege of Constantinople had begun. Behind the walls, inside the city, life took on a strange rhythm. The people of Constantinople had long known their position was precarious. Now they faced the reality of siege. The walls, though mighty, were old. Repairs had been made, but time had worn them down. The defenders numbered only about 7,000, many of them weary and poorly equipped, but within the city lived an indomitable spirit. Emperor Constantine IV, the last Byzantine emperor, moved among his people. He spoke to citizens in the streets and prayed with them in the great Hagia Sophia. Though the odds were overwhelming, Constantine swore to defend the city to the end. His calm presence inspired hope. Faith became a refuge. Services in the Hagia Sophia continued day and night. Icons were carried through the streets, and hymns filled the air. The people looked to heaven for deliverance. At night, candles flickered in windows. Behind the walls, artisans repaired cracks and reinforced gates with iron. Soldiers stood watch, knowing that at any moment the great cannon would fire. And then it began. The Ottoman guns roared to life, shaking the earth. Stones battered the walls relentlessly. Clouds of dust and smoke drifted through the city. Each day brought new damage, but the defenders toiled through exhaustion. Engineers patched breaches and piled earth behind shattered sections. Despite the fear, life continued. Bakers still baked bread. Children played in narrow alleys, too young to understand the gravity of what unfolded. Mothers whispered prayers for peace. Behind the walls, the people of Constantinople clung to faith and courage. As weeks passed, the situation grew desperate. Supplies dwindled. Outside, the Ottoman fleet tightened its grip, and Mehmed's forces prepared for a final assault. Inside the city, hope flickered, but it did not die. The fall of the gate. In late May, the hour of destiny arrived. The great walls had been battered day and night. Breaches opened wide. Constantine knew that the end was near. Still, he refused surrender. On the night of May 28th, he gathered his commanders in Hagia Sophia. There, beneath the vast dome, they prayed one last time. The emperor addressed his men with solemn words, urging them to fight with honor. Many wept openly, knowing the dawn would bring ruin. As darkness gave way to the first light of May 29th, Ottoman horns sounded across the field. The final assault began. Waves of soldiers charged the breaches. Scaling ladders rose against the walls. Cannons continued their dreadful thunder. The defenders fought valiantly. Greeks, Italians, mercenaries, all side by side. At the northern section near the Kirkaporta gate, a small postern had been left ajar during the chaos. Through this breach, Ottoman troops poured in. Word spread quickly. Panic threatened to consume the defenders. Constantine, upon hearing of the breach, rushed to the front lines. Sword in hand, clad in imperial armor stripped of royal markings, the emperor fought beside his soldiers. Witnesses would later say he shouted, "The city is lost, but I live no longer." There, amid the dust and blood, Constantine XIII fell, fighting as the last true Roman emperor. With the death of their leader and the walls broken, resistance collapsed. Ottoman soldiers surged into the city. Chaos and terror followed. Some defenders fought to the death, others fled. Civilians sought refuge in churches, including Hagia Sophia, whose great doors were eventually forced open. By noon, Mehmed entered, the city in triumph. Constantinople, the queen of cities, had fallen. The Roman Empire had come to its final tragic end. Aftermath and memory. In the days that followed, the face of Constantinople changed forever. Hagia Sophia was converted into a mosque. Many churches were repurposed or destroyed. The population was devastated, many killed, enslaved, or displaced. Yet Mehmed sought not to obliterate the city, but to transform it into the new heart of his empire. He invited artisans, scholars, and merchants to rebuild Constantinople. The city, renamed Istanbul, became the capital of the Ottoman realm. Under Mehmed's guidance, it would rise again, changed, yet still a crossroads of the world. Yet the echoes of its fall traveled far. Across Europe, the news spread like wildfire. For many, it marked the end of an era. Poets and chroniclers mourned the loss of the ancient city. In the West, it deepened fears of Ottoman expansion. For Eastern Orthodox Christians, the fall of Constantinople was a wound that would never fully heal. Over centuries, memory of the siege lingered. The bravery of Constantine V inspired legend. His last stand became a symbol of faith and sacrifice. The mighty walls of Constantinople, breached at last by cannon and courage, stood as a lesson in the limits of stone against time. Today, visitors to Istanbul still walk amid the remnants of those walls. The spirit of the city endures. Though empires rise and fall, the memory of that fateful siege in 1453 continues to whisper through the stones. Chapter 18. The Eternal Legacy. There are empires that crumble into dust and fade without a trace, and then there are empires whose breath lingers long after their final stone has fallen. The Byzantine Empire belongs to this second kind. Though its walls have been breached and its banners lowered, its voice continues to hum beneath the skin of modern life. It is not always a loud voice, sometimes no more than a whisper in an ancient manuscript, or the curve of an arch high in an old cathedral, but it is a voice that has endured. Perhaps nowhere is this gift more visible than in the Orthodox Christian world. The spiritual traditions of Eastern Orthodoxy, rich with ceremony, icons, and chants, were shaped in the golden halls of Byzantium. The great liturgies of St. John Chrysostom, once resounding beneath the dome of Hagia Sophia, still rise, each Sunday in churches from Russia to Greece, from Serbia to Antioch. The rhythm of the Byzantine religious year, with its cycles of fasting and feasting, remains alive, binding the faithful across continents and centuries. The Byzantine Empire may have fallen, But in the candlelight of Orthodox churches, its spirit still stands. Yet Byzantium's influence reached beyond its own religious sphere. In the late Middle Ages, as the empire began to wither under external pressures, many of its scholars fled westward, taking with them precious manuscripts, knowledge, and skills. These émigrés helped to spark the European Renaissance. In Florence, Venice, and other rising cities of the West, the wisdom of ancient Greek texts, preserved and studied for centuries in Constantinople, found eager new students. The revival of classical learning, which would go on to reshape European art, science, and philosophy, owed a quiet debt to the Byzantine world. Byzantine culture had been a careful steward of the past. In its libraries and scriptoria, texts from Plato, Aristotle, and Galen had been copied and preserved through dark centuries when such knowledge might have otherwise vanished. When these treasures crossed into Italy, they lit a flame in the minds of men like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo. In this way, Byzantium handed a torch to the West, one that would burn brightly in the centuries to come. There is a deeper lesson in this legacy, that ideas, once sown, can outlive the empires that first nurtured them. The Byzantines may have defended their walls with swords and fire, but their most lasting victories were of the mind and the soul, an inheritance of law. If Byzantine faith and culture shaped the spirit of later ages, its law shaped their structure. Among the many works of Emperor Justinian the Fair, none proved more enduring than his sweeping codification of Roman law, the Corpus Juris Civilis, or Body of Civil Law. Compiled in the 6th century, this monumental collection preserved centuries of legal thought and practice, distilled into a coherent system that could guide courts and rulers alike. The importance of this achievement cannot be overstated. At a time when laws were often scattered, contradictory, or tied to local custom, Justinian's code offered clarity and unity. It established principles that transcended the particulars of any single region or ruler. Concepts such as innocent, until proven guilty, the protection of private property, and the idea that law itself must be rational and just. These all found powerful expression within the Byzantine legal tradition. As the Byzantine Empire contracted and ultimately fell, Justinian's legal vision did not perish with it. In Western Europe, particularly during the 11th and 12th centuries, scholars rediscovered the Corpus Juris Civilis. It became the foundation for much of continental European law. Universities in Bologna and elsewhere taught its principles, weaving them into the fabric of emerging legal systems. Over time, these ideas spread even further, influencing the Napoleonic Code and modern civil law in countries across the world. Even today, echoes of Byzantine legal thought can be heard in courtrooms from Paris to Tokyo. The clarity of written law, the protection of individual rights, the notion that rulers themselves are bound by law. These are principles we often take for granted, yet they owe much to a Byzantine emperor who ruled 15 centuries ago. The endurance of these legal ideals reminds us that good laws, like great stories, can cross the boundaries of time and place. They can shape not only the empire that forged them, but also the worlds that follow. Icons and memory. Walk into a church where the air smells faintly of beeswax and incense. Look up at the wall and see a golden figure, flat, stylized, eyes wide and solemn. This is an icon, a window into another world, and one of the most distinctive gifts of Byzantine art. For the Byzantines, icons were never mere decoration. They were vessels of presence, bridging the earthly and the divine. To paint an icon was not simply to capture a likeness, but to craft a space where the sacred could dwell. Every line and color carried meaning. The elongated faces, The serene expressions, the shimmering gold, all were designed to draw the viewer into contemplation. The art of the icon survived the empire's fall, carried forward by Orthodox communities who treasured this visual language. Today, from the monasteries of Mount Athos to small parish churches across Eastern Europe, the Byzantine style of iconography continues to inspire. Its timeless beauty speaks not of any passing fashion, but of an enduring connection between past and present. Beyond the world of the church, Byzantine aesthetics also influenced Western art. The luminous mosaics of Ravenna, the gold ground paintings of early Italian masters, these bear clear traces of Byzantine influence. Even in the secular world, the visual language of Byzantium left its mark. But perhaps the deepest reason Byzantine art continues to resonate is this: it was born of a vision larger than itself. In an empire beset by war and change, artists created works meant not merely to record the world as it was, but to point beyond it. Icons remind us that amid the ruins of history, beauty and hope can endure. The city that was. And then there is Constantinople, the city that once stood at the crossroads of the world, between Europe and Asia, between land and sea, between the ancient and the new. Even in its fall, it captured the imagination of generations. To walk through modern Istanbul is to walk atop layers of this past. Beneath the bustling markets and crowded streets lie the foundations of imperial forums, cisterns, and churches. Hagia Sophia still rises in its quiet majesty, its great dome seeming to float on air. Though it has served as both mosque and museum, and again a mosque, it remains a living symbol of the city's layered history. For centuries, the fall of Constantinople in 1453 was mourned in the Orthodox world as a civilizational wound. Poets wrote of the city's loss with tears. Pilgrims visited its ruins with reverence. Yet even in sorrow, the story of Constantinople inspired awe. Here had stood a city that defied siege after siege, that preserved the wisdom of antiquity, that sent forth traders and scholars and artists into the world. Its tale was one of resilience. Through fire, flood, and invasion, Constantinople had endured for over 1,000 years. It had been the light of the Eastern Roman world, a beacon whose glow touched distant shores. Today, though the name Constantinople belongs to history, its legacy lives on. Istanbul remains a place of meeting, of mingling cultures, of layered beauty. In its stones and stories, the memory of Byzantium persists, not as a lost dream, but as a part of the living world. The Byzantine Empire may no longer appear on any modern map, yet its gifts are all around us. In the laws that govern nations, in the art that lifts the spirit, in the prayers of the faithful, and in the stories we tell of a city that once bridged empires. Its echo still resounds, soft but steady, through the corridors of time.